Wherever you are, wrapped in blankets, drifting in the low hum of nighttime, or simply listening with heavy eyes and a quiet breath, allow this time to belong only to you. Let the noise of the world soften. Let your mind rest in slow rhythm. Let yourself be gently carried somewhere older, not to the great cathedrals of kings nor the loud debates of medieval courts, but behind stone walls few ever saw, behind high convent gates where time moved to the ringing of bells and silence was sacred. Tonight we journey into the secretive world of medieval nunneries, a world most imagine as purely devout, even dull. Women praying, women stitching, women chanting in harmony. But behind those cold cloister walls lay a much more complex, deeply human story. These were places of deep solitude, but also whispered friendships, of spiritual struggle, and sometimes desire. Some nunneries were homes of peace, others hosts of scandal. There were rumors of midnight lovers, unexplained pregnancies, and even nuns who claimed they were tormented by demons, though others quietly wondered if their torments came from within. These are not stories of ridicule, nor are they tales of mockery. They are windows, soft, unshuttered glimpses into the difficult and sometimes contradictory lives of women who tried to live above the world while still being shaped by it. Over the next 2 hours, we'll wander gently through this shadowed landscape. We'll step into the shoes of a young girl forced into vows she never chose. We'll follow the tragic spiral of one noblewoman whose desires outran her duty. We'll examine strange cases of so-called possession and the rituals that claimed to drive them out. And we'll end with a quiet reflection on the Church's long, silent attempts to cover what it could not control. But it all begins, as many medieval lives did, not with fire or fame, but with family and obedience, and a door that closed behind you. So if you're ready, let go of the day behind you. Let the stillness come, and let's begin. It often started before the girl could even speak her own mind. A promise made at birth. A decision arranged over wine, signed with wax, and sealed with prayer. She might have been 5, she might have been 13. Her name, perhaps, was recorded in the charter as Agnes, or Clara, or Isolde, but for many, the record of that name is the only part of their life that survives. In medieval Europe, entering the religious life was not always an act of divine calling. Sometimes it was a matter of survival, sometimes it was duty, and sometimes it was simply the least disruptive option for a family with too many mouths to feed and too few sons. For noble families especially, daughters could be liabilities. Marrying them off was expensive, requiring dowries, negotiations, and a steady supply of political favors. But sending a daughter to a convent, that required just one donation, one piece of land, 1 year's tithe. It was a bargain, financially speaking, and it ensured that the girl would live somewhere safe, somewhere fed, and most importantly, somewhere obedient. The girl, for her part, was told she was being honored, chosen for God, given a life above the messiness of marriage or childbirth. But she likely understood the truth in quieter, more practical terms. Her brothers would ride and inherit, she would pray and remain. The process began with the oblation, a formal giving of the child to the church. In many cases, this happened astonishingly young. Records exist of girls as young as 5 or 6 being handed over to a convent, sometimes with barely enough language to understand what was happening. She might be led by the hand into the cloister, still clinging to a wooden doll or a crust of bread, her family standing solemn behind her as the abbess greeted her with a smile that was neither warm nor cold, simply inevitable. There was ritual, of course, always ritual. The girl would be blessed, her clothes removed, and replaced with a plain habit. Sometimes her hair was cut. She might be told to renounce the world, though no one expected her to fully understand that yet. She was now a puer oblatus, a child offered. At first, life might have seemed more like school than imprisonment. There were lessons in Latin, in singing the psalms, in embroidery and herb lore. Older nuns became caretakers. There was a schedule. There were meals. There was warmth. In many ways, for some, this life was better than what waited outside. But for others, the silence was the first wound, the separation from siblings, the absence of a mother's voice, the bell that replaced the rhythm of laughter. Over time, the girl would come to know the sounds of the cloister more intimately than she ever knew the noises of home. The cold slap of water in the basin each morning, the scraping of wooden benches against stone, the endless echo of steps in the hallways. And always the bells. The cloister was a world of structure. There was a time to rise, usually before dawn, and a time to sleep, usually not long after dusk. Between those points were prayers at regular intervals, called the Divine Office. There were at least 8 of these each day, and more on feast days. The girl learned to chant without thinking, to fold her hands without trembling, to kneel even when her knees ached. As she grew, her responsibilities expanded. She learned to care for the sick, to mend habits, to illuminate small manuscripts, to tend the small garden where medicinal herbs were grown. If the convent had animals, chickens, or goats, she might help with feeding. The tasks were not cruel, but they were constant. At a certain point, usually between 14 and 20, the girl would be asked if she wished to take her final vows. The question, posed with solemn formality, was rarely a true inquiry. Few dared say no. Some didn't understand that they could. The ceremony of profession was beautiful in its way. The girl would lie face down on the cold stone of the chapel floor as the community sang over her. She would rise, her veil now black instead of white. She would receive a ring symbolizing her marriage to Christ, and perhaps a new name taken from a saint. From that day forward, she was dead to the world. The gate to the cloister, once merely symbolic, became real, but not every nun stayed willingly. Some ran. Records from many convents include notes, usually terse, often scolding, about sisters who fled the enclosure or broke the sacred veil. Sometimes they were retrieved by force or persuasion. Sometimes they disappeared into towns or even married in secret. The Church did not take kindly to such acts. Runaway nuns, if caught, could be confined, whipped, or excommunicated. But their very existence tells us something important. Not all vocations were chosen freely. Not all hearts stayed calm behind stone. And yet, for those who remained, either by conviction, resignation, or lack of alternatives, the cloister became life. The outside world blurred, then faded. Seasons passed behind latticed windows. Family visits became rare, and then stopped. News from beyond came only through letters, brought by clerics who never lingered long. Some of these women found peace in the pattern. They rose before dawn. They prayed. They worked. They slept. The rhythm became the meaning. Others lived with the quiet ache of wondering, what if? But few said so aloud. Silence was both a rule and a refuge, and in that silence, over time, the girl became a woman, a nun, a sister, a soul marked not by fire or fame, but by the sound of bells echoing in empty stone corridors and the weight of a life folded into habit. Imagine waking in a room where no clocks tick, no morning alarms buzz, no one shouts your name to start the day. Instead, what breaks the silence is a bell. A soft, clear toll that drifts through narrow hallways, rising into the wooden rafters of the dormitory like a call from some deeper place. The room is still half dark. A pale glow filters through the small, unglazed windows, catching the mist of your breath in the chill air. The stone walls, thick and unmoving, hold the night's cold well into the morning. This is how your day begins. Not with urgency, not with freedom, but with structure, but with the rule of Saint Benedict, followed by many nunneries across medieval Europe, divided the day into a sacred cycle of hours, each marked by prayer. These were known as the canonical hours, and they stitched the lives of cloistered women into a tapestry of devotion so tightly woven that little else could slip through. The first bell, for matins, might ring as early as 2 or 3 in the morning. You rise quietly from your bed, little more than a straw-filled sack on a wooden frame, and dress in the dark. The habit is thick wool, scratchy against the skin, heavy on your shoulders. Its folds are familiar now, like a second skin. You wrap your scapula across your chest and fasten your veil. No mirror is needed. You are not expected to look at yourself. The other sisters stir around you, but no one speaks. Voices are reserved for prayer. The air is filled only with rustling cloth and the soft padding of feet against stone. You walk together to the chapel, your breath ghosting in the cold. Inside, candles are already lit. Their glow flickers across the faces of saints carved into the walls. You kneel. The psalms begin. You do not sing for an audience. There is no music in the modern sense, no melody meant to charm, just plain chant, steady, sombre, and slow. The syllables rise and fall like tides. You've memorized most of them, not because you studied, but because you have said them so many times that your mouth knows them without your mind needing to ask. After matins comes lauds, then a short silence before prime. Then breakfast, if it's permitted that day. A piece of coarse bread, maybe a little cheese. In some orders, you eat in silence while one sister reads aloud from a devotional text. In others, there is no reading, only the sounds of chewing and the scraping of spoons against wooden bowls. You return to the chapel after eating. Terce, then sext, then nun. More psalms, more prayer, more kneeling. Between these, there is work. The tasks vary from one convent to another. In a larger nunnery, with lands and tenants, there may be dozens of jobs to choose from. In smaller ones, labour is more personal. You might be assigned to the kitchen, hauling water, preparing vegetables, kneading dough, or to the garden, gathering herbs, pulling weeds, turning compost. You may work in the infirmary, tending to sick sisters with vinegar-soaked cloths and soft hymns, or in the scriptorium, copying prayers with a quill that stains your fingers black. There is no sense of rush, but neither is there rest. The rhythm of the day demands constant motion, not fast, but always forward. 1 hour into the next, each marked by another bell. The light changes as you move through your duties. Morning grey warms into noon. The sun glances through high-set windows. Shadows shift across the floor. You begin to know time not by the sun's position, but by the feel of it. A certain hunger that comes just before sext. A dull ache in the knees that signals the approach of vespers. And always the bells. The bell tower is the true clock of your world. Each toll echoes through the convent, calling you to pause, to gather, to return. It does not alarm, it reminds. And the rhythm it creates becomes not just a schedule, but a shape to your life. By mid-afternoon, fatigue sets in. You have walked and knelt and sung and scrubbed. Your arms are sore from the laundry trough, your hands rough from cold water. But there is no complaint. Only the knowledge that Vespers is coming, that the day is winding down. Evening, brings a final meal, again modest. Sometimes a stew, sometimes just bread. Conversation is still rare. You may exchange a glance, a soft smile, but your tongue is not yours to use freely. In some orders, you may speak only in sign language unless given permission. Compline arrives just after sunset, the final prayers of the day. They are slow and low and often the most intimate. The chapel is darker now, the flames gentler. Your voice is hoarse from the day's repetitions, but you sing still. And then, the great silence. From the final bell until the morning light, the convent falls into near total quiet. No questions, no tasks, no sound beyond the wind in the trees or the creaking of wood. You return to your cell, you remove your shoes, you lie on your straw mattress, and you let the rhythm of the day recede like a tide. Some nights, sleep comes quickly. Other nights, you lie awake, watching moonlight crawl along the ceiling. The world outside is unknowable, distant. It does not concern you anymore. Some sisters find peace in this structure, a comfort in knowing what each hour holds. There is no surprise, no fear, only the soft discipline of repetition. Others struggle. Not every soul thrives on sameness. Not every mind quiets so easily. Some grow restless. Some harbor memories of another life, of a child once held, a song once danced to, a hand once touched. These thoughts come in the silence, and they stay until matins calls them back to order. But most endure. Some even flourish, because the rhythm, over time, becomes less like a cage and more like a pulse. It steadies you, grounds you, gives shape to days that would otherwise drift. And perhaps that is the secret of cloistered life. It is not about ecstasy, not about mystical visions or divine voices. It is about showing up, again and again, kneeling when the bell rings, singing when the psalms begin, folding linens when they need folding, pulling carrots from the dirt because someone must eat. It is not glamorous, but it is whole. A life built not on passion, but on patience, not on freedom, but on rhythm. And in that rhythm, for some, a kind of peace. It's easy to imagine the life of a medieval nun as one of deprivation, cold halls, sparse meals, endless hours of prayer. And in many ways it was, but such a view is incomplete. Beneath the simplicity and severity of the habit lay certain comforts, privileges even that many women in the outside world could scarcely dream of. To begin with, there was safety. For women living in the medieval countryside or cities, daily life brought constant vulnerability. Illness, childbirth, hunger, and violence lurked close at hand, and often with little warning. The roads were dangerous, and power was often held by those who abused it. A woman alone had few rights. A woman in a marriage could find herself tethered for life, even to cruelty. But inside the convent walls, a different reality quietly unfolded. Here, a woman had a space of her own, even if shared. Her life was not controlled by a husband, nor dictated by childbirth. Her time was not spent caring for children she might lose, nor was she forced to beg for protection or favor. The convent offered not freedom in the modern sense, but a kind of structured autonomy. Within its walls, a nun could live to old age, receive education, and hold positions of leadership that were unthinkable in secular life. Education, in particular, was one of the most unexpected gifts of the cloister. While most medieval women, especially those of the lower classes, were illiterate, many nuns could read, write, and speak Latin. Convents often maintained libraries, some with impressive collections of scripture, theological commentary, medicine, and even classical texts. A literate sister might spend her days copying manuscripts, illuminating margins with careful gold leaf, or composing prayers and letters. Some wrote treatises on spirituality, or compiled medical knowledge based on herbal remedies passed down through generations. For a certain kind of mind, the nunnery was a sanctuary of intellect. It was not uncommon for abbesses to engage in correspondence with bishops, scholars, or even royalty. Their opinions were sought, their advice recorded. Within the church's hierarchy, a respected abbess could wield a kind of quiet influence, especially if her convent was wealthy or strategically important. Music, too, was a daily part of life. Plain chant, solemn and steady, might sound repetitive to modern ears, but to those who practiced it, it became a source of deep calm. Singing in unison, without harmony or performance, had a meditative effect. The vibrations echoed through stone and flesh alike. Over time, the chants became familiar companions, as comforting as breath. They offered not just praise, but rhythm and a subtle joy in participation. Even in material terms, some convents were surprisingly well appointed, especially those founded by royal or noble patrons. While no one lived in luxury, the more successful abbeys had warm cloisters, glazed windows, private gardens, and well-stocked kitchens. The food may have been simple, but it was regular. Bread, cheese, eggs, vegetables, and on feast days, fish or meat. In times of famine, when villagers went hungry, the sisters still had enough to eat. And then there was the community. While silence governed much of the day, human connection found other channels, gestures, glances, shared work. Over time, friendships bloomed in quiet ways. A sister who slipped you an extra piece of bread. A warm hand resting on your shoulder during prayers. A knowing look exchanged during a long vigil. These small moments, scattered like petals across the routine, brought comfort and even happiness. For some, these connections grew deeper. Close companionships, what we might now call romantic friendships, were not uncommon in cloistered life. Women who shared the same cell for years, who prayed side by side, worked shoulder to shoulder, and learned each other's thoughts through silence. While the church sometimes expressed concern over such attachments, they often turned a blind eye, as long as the sisters remained outwardly obedient. The love between nuns could be a source of profound emotional sustenance, anchoring them in a life otherwise stripped of family and affection. And while forbidden desires did arise, there were also bonds that never crossed the line into scandal. Bonds, nonetheless, rich and sustaining. In a world where so much was denied, these relationships offered tenderness, recognition, and a sense of being seen. The convent also granted something surprisingly rare for medieval women: time. Time to think, time to reflect, time not dictated by a husband's demands or a child's cries. The steady schedule, though strict, carved out mental space. Between psalms and needlework, between garden chores and prayers, there was a kind of mental breathing room. For a woman of curiosity or contemplation, this was a gift. And for those who rose in the ranks, especially the abbess, the habit became a symbol not of humility, but of authority. An abbess was elected by her sisters. She controlled the budget, oversaw property, directed labor, and decided matters of discipline. She negotiated with bishops, she oversaw guests, she could even, in some regions, hear confessions or deliver sermons to her sisters. Her word held weight, her presence commanded respect. She was, within her realm, a ruler. Of course, not all convents were equal. Wealthy houses differed from poor ones. Some had scriptoriums, others did not. Some offered music and education, others functioned more like almshouses or shelters. But in all, the veil offered a kind of shield, a way of stepping out of the narrow expectations placed upon most women in medieval society. And perhaps the strangest comfort of the habit was that it answered the question of purpose. In a world filled with uncertainty, sin, plague, and war, knowing your role in life, knowing that you rose to pray, that your prayers had meaning, that your suffering had purpose, brought a strange kind of peace. There is something soothing, even today, in imagining that life. Not easy, not free, but quiet, contained, structured, and, within its own boundaries, meaningful. So, while the cloister has long been painted as a prison, for many it was also a refuge, a place where learning, healing, and spiritual inquiry were possible. A world apart, a space between body and soul. And in that space, a woman could become something more than just wife or mother. She could become scholar, leader, singer, scribe, or healer. And perhaps in moments of candlelight and soft chant, even something close to whole. Inside a cloister, everything is meant to turn the soul upward. The bells, the prayers, the cold stone architecture, each serves to detach the sister from the world. But no matter how high the walls, how thick the silence, or how devout the discipline, the human heart does not forget how to feel. It may be trained, suppressed, or redirected, but it does not stop. In medieval convents where women lived in near constant proximity, often from adolescence to death, feelings bloomed. Not just affection or admiration, but sometimes something more intense, something the Church tried hard not to name. Affection between nuns was officially discouraged, not because companionship was seen as bad, but because it could distract from devotion. The rule of Benedict warns against particular friendships, those relationships in which one sister becomes overly attached to another. Such bonds, the rule insisted, sowed discord and bred favoritism. But the very warning reveals how common such attachments were. In real life, emotions did not always heed spiritual caution. Imagine spending your entire adult life alongside another person, praying beside them, eating beside them, sleeping in a cell separated by just a curtain or a thin wall. Over years, glances became habits, gestures became comfort, laughter, rare and precious, became a shared secret. It was only natural that some hearts aligned more closely than others. In the records of many convents we find traces, never flamboyant, always veiled, of emotional entanglements, letters between sisters that read like quiet love notes, disciplinary reports noting excessive affection or unseemly closeness, a shared blanket that raised eyebrows, a sudden transfer of one sister to another part of the house without explanation. None of these details prove scandal, but they suggest a truth. Even among vows of chastity and silence, the ache for connection remained. Sometimes the feelings took a more explicitly forbidden shape. In rare but notable cases, nuns formed attachments not with each other, but with outsiders, visiting priests, confessors, or even laymen. These encounters could be as fleeting as a shared glance in the cloister parlour, or as daring as whispered conversations during confession. One of the more common opportunities for such temptations came through the role of the convent confessor. These men, often appointed by the Church, were allowed to speak with the sisters in privacy, to guide them spiritually, and to hear their sins. The dynamic was inherently imbalanced. He, the representative of God, she, the penitent soul, but where there is authority, there is also vulnerability. Not every confessor abused this access. Many remained professional, even distant. But a few, it seems, allowed a softness to bloom. The line between pastoral care and emotional intimacy blurred. The soul, after all, is a tender thing, and to bear it, day after day, can forge a closeness that neither party intended. Some relationships perhaps never left the realm of thought, a quickened breath, a longing held at bay, but others crossed lines. Inquisition records from the late Middle Ages sometimes mention convents under investigation for sexual misconduct, not always in explicit terms, but with phrases like corruption of morals, unchaste conduct, or scandal within the enclosure. One such case tells of a nun who had secretly exchanged letters with a monk from a nearby abbey. Their correspondence, written in cloaked metaphors, referenced the Song of Songs and the Passion of Christ, biblical texts that, when interpreted sensually, allowed a kind of plausible deniability. When discovered, the letters were burned. The nun was confined to her cell for a year of penance. The monk was reassigned to a distant monastery. The abbess issued no public explanation, but not every forbidden desire involved action. Often the longing remained internal. A tension felt only in the still hours before dawn, a dream that lingered after waking, a memory of a brother's face, a yearning sparked by a visitor's voice. These longings were not sins, the sisters were taught, only temptations. And temptations must be endured. To help, the convent imposed strict rules. Sisters were forbidden from touching one another without permission. Conversations outside official duties were curtailed. The parlour, where visitors were received, was often fitted with grilles or screens, ensuring that no physical contact was possible. Even letters had to be approved by the abbess before sending, but discipline alone could not prevent the heart from stirring. There is a certain irony in this. The very isolation meant to protect purity also intensified desire. Without other distractions, feelings magnified. A smile carried more weight. A kind word lingered longer. Emotional hunger sharpened in the absence of touch, novelty, or variety. And in that hunger, some sisters turned inward. They wrote poems, composed hymns, created prayers so beautiful that their passion could scarcely be concealed. One nun wrote of Christ as her beloved, describing him in terms so sensual that her superiors later edited the text. Another imagined herself as the bride in the Song of Songs, aching for union with the divine. These were not confessions of carnal lust, but they reflected the intense inner landscape of women who, though cloistered, remained deeply human. There were also stories, often whispered, rarely proven, of sisters who became pregnant. Sometimes the result of rape, sometimes the result of hidden affairs. When this happened, the scandal could shake the entire community. The nun might be removed, punished, or transferred. In some cases, the infant was taken away immediately, placed in the care of an orphanage or loyal lay family. The records, if they exist at all, are brief, carefully worded, designed to preserve dignity while signalling disgrace. But we must remember these were the exceptions. Most nuns lived out their lives in faithful routine. They prayed, they worked, they endured. Still, the exceptions tell us something vital, that the cloister was not immune to the same forces that shaped all human life: desire, affection, temptation, regret. To live as a nun was to be caught in a paradox, to strive for heaven while still being made of flesh. To renounce the world while remembering its scent, to love without touching, to ache without speaking. And in this quiet, painful balance, there was a strange kind of beauty, because these women were not saints, they were not symbols, they were people, complicated, devoted, flawed, and still seeking something greater than themselves. In the world beyond the convent walls, punishment could be swift and brutal. A thief might lose a hand, a heretic could be burned. A woman suspected of impropriety might find herself cast out, disgraced, or worse. But inside the cloister, where women were meant to live above such base affairs, punishment took on a different shape, less about pain, more about the soul, more about control. For a nun, sin was not measured in action alone, but in thought, in intention, in the small trespasses that threatened the fabric of spiritual life. A careless word, a flash of envy, a moment of resentment. These were faults to be addressed, and the convent had many tools with which to do so. At the heart of this quiet discipline was confession. For many orders, daily confession was the norm. Each sister would kneel before the appointed confessor, a man, usually a monk or priest, from outside, and speak aloud her failings. not just sins of the flesh, but thoughts, feelings, doubts. These confessions were taken seriously, recorded, and sometimes used to guide decisions about penance, but not all matters remained private. When a transgression threatened the unity of the community, say a rule broken in plain sight, or a forbidden attachment formed between sisters, it could be addressed publicly. The offending nun might be called to stand during chapter, the daily meeting where business was conducted and discipline handed down. There, in front of her sisters, she would confess her fault. She might lower her head, her hands trembling in her sleeves. She would name what she had done, spoken during silence, exchanged letters without permission, touched a visitor's hand too long. The other sisters would listen in silence, their faces composed, their thoughts hidden. Then would come the penance. In its gentler forms, penance might be symbolic. Kneeling in the refectory during meals, not eating for a day, reciting extra prayers through the night. But for more serious offences, the consequences deepened. A sister might be denied communion, forbidden from speaking, excluded from communal meals and prayers. She might be assigned to a different cell, isolated, even shunned. In rare cases, she could be confined to her room for months at a time, allowed only bread, water, and a small crucifix for company. There are records of nuns being forced to wear garments of rough wool as a mark of shame. Others were made to sleep on the bare floor. Some were stripped of privileges like access to the library or the ability to write letters. For those who cherished the rhythm of cloistered life, these removals were painful. And yet the purpose of such punishments was not revenge. It was restoration, correction. The system was meant to bring the errant soul back into harmony with the rule, to remind her of the life she had chosen or been given. But behind this structure of penance was another system, more insidious. Surveillance. The convent was not a place of anonymity. You were always seen, always heard. The very silence that governed daily life made it easier to notice deviation. A whisper where none should be. A gesture repeated too often. A shadow that passed a certain cell too many times after dark. Some convents designated sisters as monitors or incorrectors, women whose role was to observe and report. These were not always sinister figures. In many cases they acted with compassion, offering quiet guidance. But the mere knowledge that someone was always watching changed the atmosphere of daily life. Intimacy became risky, vulnerability a liability. Even the architecture encouraged supervision. Many convents were designed with long, narrow halls where footsteps echoed. Doors lacked locks, cells were simple and open to the air. Windows looked not outward, but inward, onto courtyards and cloisters where movement could be seen from every angle. The abbess or prioress often had an elevated room, allowing her to observe the chapel, refectory, or workspaces unseen. This constant visibility was both comforting and suffocating. For a woman truly devoted to the rule, it was a blessing to be reminded of one's place, to never stray far. But for others, it bred fear, anxiety, a sense that one's own thoughts were not truly one's own. Letters, if allowed, were screened. Visitors were rare, and when received were seen only in the parlour, often through a grated screen or across a table with a curtain. Even then, conversation was closely monitored. A sister who lingered too long, who laughed too brightly, might be questioned later. But perhaps the most complex aspect of this discipline was the role of the abbess. She was both guide and enforcer, mother and judge. Elected by her peers, she held authority not only over daily matters, but over souls. She decided punishments, heard confessions, intervened when a sister strayed too far. Some abbesses ruled with gentleness, guiding through example and patience. Others ruled with steel. There are accounts of abbesses who demanded absolute obedience, who punished with harsh fasts, public shaming, or enforced silence. The character of a convent could change dramatically depending on who wore the ring and carried the staff. And yet, despite this structure of oversight, transgressions occurred. Bonds formed, rules were bent, desire flickered, the human soul is not easily caged, even in stone. And so the cycle continued. Sin, confession, penance, forgiveness, a rhythm, not unlike the prayers that structured each day, a rhythm as old as the church itself. This system of surveillance and correction might seem cold, but to the women who lived within it, it was a form of intimacy, a way of living fully seen, fully known, and in being known, perhaps forgiven. Because in the end, the cloister was not meant to erase the self, but to shape it. And shaping, as any potter will tell you, requires pressure. To become a nun in the Middle Ages was to be seen, at least in theory, as a bride of Christ. Holy, untouchable, a woman no longer of the world, but beyond it, the very image of piety. But as with all images cast in light, a shadow formed behind it, because even behind the veil, even in silence, the human heart remained restless, fallible, whole. There was a reason the church held up certain women as saints, because most could not reach such heights. The saints were exceptions, radiant stories. Their lives were filled with visions and ecstasies, extreme acts of denial, even miracles. They fasted until bones showed through the skin, wept blood, claimed divine visitations in the dark. These were women who, it was said, had truly left the world behind. But they were rare. Most nuns, quiet, dutiful, unseen, did not blaze with spiritual fire. They lived slow, repetitive lives, marked not by visions, but by routine. They washed linens, copied texts, lit candles, tended gardens, sang psalms. Their holiness was not radiant. It was steady, enduring, sometimes bored, sometimes doubtful, always striving. And in that striving lived the great tension, to live in the body but deny its pull, to feel but not speak, to think but not wander, to exist wholly within boundaries that no man was asked to live in quite the same way. The church expected much of these women. They were to be modest, obedient, chaste in body and mind. They were to keep silence, guard their eyes, hold their hands folded at all times. Even their dreams were suspect. If a sister admitted in confession to dreaming of touch, of warmth, of pleasure, she was often told it was a temptation, or worse, the work of demons. Yet the very need to enforce these rules reveals how impossible they were to perfectly follow. In this, nunneries became quiet stages where the drama of humanity played out under the guise of perfect control. Sisters fought with one another, not with fists, but with looks, with silence, with absence. Envy bloomed when one was favoured by the abbess. Pride crept in when a woman became known for her voice, or her embroidery, or her sharp memory of scripture. Some relished small privileges, others suffered in unnoticed corners. There were tears, anger, laughter too, though it had to be hidden. There were illnesses that had no name and griefs that could not be spoken. Imagine living 30, 40, 60 years within a handful of rooms, under the gaze of God and the rule, and trying, truly trying, to be perfect, and knowing always that you were not. And yet, within this tension, something remarkable often emerged: grace. Not the kind sung about in chapels, but the quiet kind, the grace of patience, of forgiveness, of beginning again, each morning with the same psalm, the same prayer, the same cold water on the face. A kind of holiness not born from miracle, but from repetition. It was a holiness forged in the fire of frustration. in the silence of longing, in the moment when a sister confessed her failings and was not cast out, but returned to the fold. There are records of nuns who struggled all their lives with doubt, who confessed the same thoughts week after week, who admitted to pride, to jealousy, even to wishing for a life outside. And still, they remained. They rose, they prayed, they endured. That too was a form of sanctity. And the Church, for all its lofty ideals, knew this. For every rule there was a mercy, for every penance a path back. The goal was not to purge all sin, but to strive toward a higher self, one prayer, one mistake, one forgiveness at a time. Some sisters came to understand their humanity not as a flaw, but as the ground in which their devotion took root. They did not seek to be saints in the eyes of others. They simply sought quiet lives, meaningful work, and a place where their souls could rest. Of course, the tension never vanished, not fully. It hummed beneath the surface of daily life, the contrast between what they were supposed to be and what they were. Between the image of the Virgin Bride of Christ and the reality of a woman who missed her family, who secretly loved her friend, who sometimes wondered what the world beyond the wall had become, this tension was not failure, it was life. And in many ways it made the devotion of these women all the more powerful, not because they were perfect, but because they chose their vows again and again, even in imperfection. They were saints and sinners both, mothers without children, wives without husbands, women without a public face, but not without deep, layered selves. They lived in rooms lit by candlelight. They sang in chapels that echoed with their own footsteps. They slept in cells the size of modern closets. They wept alone and together. They baked bread, brewed medicine, tended the dying, prayed for the living. And when they died, most were buried quietly, their names etched in soft stone or written in fading ink. But for a time, for a life, they lived in that space between two worlds, not quite of heaven, not quite of earth, just human, just faithful, just there. By the time Agnes reached her 17th year within St. Elred's Abbey, the world outside her cloister had changed. Lotharingia, once stable in its uneasy truce between noble houses, had begun to shift again. Borders blurred, ambitions sharpened, and in those movements her family's name re-emerged from the quiet folds of provincial obscurity. It began, as many such stirrings did, with a letter, delivered by a hooded messenger, stamped with her father's seal, and handed to the abbess with due formality. Letters to nuns were always screened, read first by the head of the house before being passed along, or not. This one, however, passed inspection. When Agnes received it, sealed anew in the abbess's hand, she recognized her brother's script immediately. Angular, deliberate, but marred here and there by ink blotches and hurried strokes. A soldier's hand, not a scribe's. He wrote of campaigns in the eastern marches where Germanic barons had defied the emperor and drawn swords in protest. He wrote of feasts in smoky halls, of messengers bearing gold, of whispers of new alliances that might bring glory to their house once more. And tucked between the formalities, he wrote of memory, of childhood games in the orchard, of her laugh when she climbed the tower steps too fast, of the way she used to sneak extra honeyed figs from the kitchen. Reading it, Agnes felt something stir. It wasn't yearning exactly, more like a quiet pressure in her chest, the realization that she had once belonged to a world filled with faces and places and stakes far beyond the garden wall. She read the letter again that evening by candlelight, her fingers lingering over each line. It smelled faintly of smoke and pine, and she imagined her brother writing it beside a crackling hearth in some mountain keep, his sword leaning against the wall. More letters followed, not often, perhaps 3 or 4 a year, but regular enough to create a rhythm. He described the crumbling loyalties of minor lords, the growing influence of their distant cousin who now served in the imperial court, the maneuverings of their father to reclaim old titles through loyalty or war. She was not asked for her thoughts, not yet, but the tone shifted subtly over time, mentions of churchland, hints of influence. Questions about the abbey's holdings, about the abbess's age, about who had the emperor's ear in local ecclesiastical matters. Agnes, ever cautious, answered in guarded script. She reported on the state of the gardens, the health of the sisters, the generous repair of the bell tower after winter storms. Nothing treasonous, nothing unseemly. But her letters, though written with modest grace, travelled back to men who could read between the lines. She began to sense what they were doing. She was no fool. Her brother, now a respected commander with a growing household, saw her as more than a sister. She was a bridge, a connection, a silent link between the ambitions of her blood and the power of the church. Even behind a veil, she was still part of the game. And it was not just him. Her father, who had barely written since she took her vows, now sent parchment bound with red cord. The letters bore advice, warnings, invitations to speak with abbots who happened to be travelling nearby. In one, he wrote, "You wear the veil, my daughter, but the veil does not close your eyes to duty." Duty. That word again. It had brought her to St. Elred's in the first place. It followed her still, like a shadow in the cloister walk. The abbess, wise to these movements, did not confront her directly, but Agnes noticed the change. The subtle pause when her name was mentioned during chapter. The hesitations during morning readings. The way visitors were now seated farther from the parlour grate when they came asking for the noble sister. The silence was not cold, but heavy, intentional. She began to feel watched, not by any one sister, but by the house itself. The rhythm of the bells no longer felt quite so neutral. Her walks in the herb garden were no longer private. Even the stone saints in the cloister seemed to gaze a little harder. Still the letters kept coming, and part of her welcomed them. In the quiet world of the abbey, they became a thread back to another life. Not a life she longed to return to, at least not consciously, but a life that shaped her. They reminded her that she had once been more than Sister Agnes. She had been Agnes of Lotharingia, a daughter of firelit halls and guarded secrets. She remembered her mother's rings, the tilt of her father's voice when he gave orders, her brother's boyish oath to make her proud. Now he wanted her support, not as a sister but as a woman of the church. He spoke of relic transfers, of cloister expansion, of the abbey gaining special favour if it cooperated in subtle realignments. Nothing direct, nothing that would damn a soul, just nudges, suggestions, a sense that her life of prayer might serve a higher cause. Agnes struggled with these implications. She did not want power, not in the way men sought it, but she also did not want irrelevance. Was it truly wrong, she wondered, to help her family regain its station so long as no one was harmed? Was influence a sin or merely a burden? The rules said little on such nuance. Some nights she sat in the scriptorium long after the others had gone. The candles burned low, the ink dried at her pen's tip. She would gaze at the stone floor, tracing its worn grooves, and wonder, had her vows made her immune to ambition? Or had they simply masked it in holier language? There were moments, brief but clear, when she wanted to tear the letters apart, to cast them into the fire and return fully to the silence she had once accepted. But she didn't. She placed them carefully into a small wooden box beneath her cot. She tied them with ribbon. She read them again when doubt crept in. By her 20th year in the abbey, the sisters began to look to her for guidance. She had grown into her role with elegance, calm in prayer, steady in work, generous in instruction. The abbess trusted her to mentor the younger novices, to oversee the inventory of sacred vessels, even to accompany visiting clergy to the chapter room. It was in that rising influence that the old world found its opening. Her brother sent word that a certain priest would be arriving soon, a poet by reputation, a friend to their house. A man of both God and good sense, the letter said. You will enjoy speaking with him. And with that, the web was drawn tighter. One strand laid gently across the quiet days of St. Elred's. Agnes folded the letter. Her hand did not shake, but somewhere deep within her something stirred, a faint echo of footsteps from a life she had never quite left behind. By the time Agnes reached her 17th year within St. Elred's Abbey, the world outside her cloister had changed. Lotharingia, once stable in its uneasy truce between noble houses, had begun to shift again, borders blurred, ambitions sharpened, and in those movements her family's name re-emerged from the quiet folds of provincial obscurity. It began, as many such stirrings did, with a letter, delivered by a hooded messenger stamped with her father's seal and handed to the abbess with due formality. Letters to nuns were always screened, read first by the head of the house before being passed along, or not. This one, however, passed inspection. When Agnes received it, sealed anew in the abbess's hand, she recognized her brother's script immediately, angular, deliberate, but marred here and there by ink blotches and hurried strokes. A soldier's hand, not a scribe's. He wrote of campaigns in the eastern marches where Germanic barons had defied the emperor and drawn swords in protest. He wrote of feasts in smoky halls, of messengers bearing gold, of whispers of new alliances that might bring glory to their house once more. And tucked between the formalities, he wrote of memory, of childhood games in the orchard, of her laugh when she climbed the tower steps too fast, of the way she used to sneak extra honeyed figs from the kitchen. Reading it, Agnes felt something stir. It wasn't yearning exactly, more like a quiet pressure in her chest, the realization that she had once belonged to a world filled with faces and places and stakes far beyond the garden wall. She read the letter again that evening by candlelight, her fingers lingering over each line. It smelled faintly of smoke and pine, and she imagined her brother writing it beside a crackling hearth in some mountain keep, his sword leaning against the wall. More letters followed, not often, perhaps 3 or 4 a year, but regular enough to create a rhythm. He described the crumbling loyalties of minor lords, the growing influence of their distant cousin who now served in the imperial court, the maneuverings of their father to reclaim old titles through loyalty or war. She was not asked for her thoughts, not yet, but the tone shifted subtly over time, mentions of churchland, hints of influence, questions about the abbey's holdings, about the abbess's age, about who had the emperor's ear in local ecclesiastical matters. Agnes, ever cautious, answered in guarded script. She reported on the state of the gardens, the health of the sisters, the generous repair of the bell tower after winter storms. Nothing treasonous, nothing unseemly. But her letters, though written with modest grace, travelled back to men who could read between the lines. She began to sense what they were doing. She was no fool. Her brother, now a respected commander with a growing household, saw her as more than a sister. She was a bridge, a connection, a silent link between the ambitions of her blood and the power of the church. Even behind a veil, she was still part of the game. And it was not just him. Her father, who had barely written since she took her vows, now sent parchment bound with red cord. The letters bore advice, warnings, invitations to speak with abbots who happened to be travelling nearby. In one he wrote, "You wear the veil, my daughter, but the veil does not close your eyes to duty." Duty, that word again. It had brought her to St. Elred's in the first place. It followed her still, like a shadow in the cloister walk. The abbess, wise to these movements, did not confront her directly, but Agnes noticed the change. The subtle pause when her name was mentioned during chapter. The hesitations during morning readings. The way visitors were now seated farther from the parlour grate when they came asking for the noble sister. The silence was not cold but heavy, intentional. She began to feel watched, not by any one sister but by the house itself. The rhythm of the bells no longer felt quite so neutral. Her walks in the herb garden were no longer private. Even the stone saints in the cloister seemed to gaze a little harder. Still the letters kept coming, and part of her welcomed them. In the quiet world of the abbey, they became a thread back to another life. Not a life she longed to return to, at least not consciously, but a life that shaped her. They reminded her that she had once been more than Sister Agnes. She had been Agnes of Lotharingia, a daughter of firelit halls and guarded secrets. She remembered her mother's rings, the tilt of her father's voice when he gave orders, her brother's boyish oath to make her proud. Now he wanted her support, not as a sister but as a woman of the church. He spoke of relic transfers, of cloister expansion, of the abbey gaining special favour if it cooperated in subtle realignments. Nothing direct, nothing that would damn a soul, just nudges, suggestions, a sense that her life of prayer might serve a higher cause. Agnes struggled with these implications. She did not want power, not in the way men sought it, but she also did not want irrelevance. Was it truly wrong, she wondered, to help her family regain its station so long as no one was harmed? Was influence a sin or merely a burden? The rules said little on such nuance. Some nights she sat in the scriptorium long after the others had gone. The candles burned low. The ink dried at her pen's tip. She would gaze at the stone floor, tracing its worn grooves, and wonder, had her vows made her immune to ambition? Or had they simply masked it in holier language? There were moments, brief but clear, when she wanted to tear the letters apart, to cast them into the fire and return fully to the silence she had once accepted. But she didn't. She placed them carefully into a small wooden box beneath her cot. She tied them with ribbon. She read them again when doubt crept in. By her 20th year in the abbey, the sisters began to look to her for guidance. She had grown into her role with elegance, calm in prayer, steady in work, generous in instruction. The abbess trusted her to mentor the younger novices, to oversee the inventory of sacred vessels, even to accompany visiting clergy to the chapter room. It was in that rising influence that the old world found its opening. Her brother sent word that a certain priest would be arriving soon, a poet by reputation, a friend to their house, a man of both God and good sense, the letter said. You will enjoy speaking with him. And with that, the web was drawn tighter. One strand laid gently across the quiet days of St. Elred's. Agnes folded the letter. Her hand did not shake. But somewhere deep within her, something stirred. A faint echo of footsteps from a life she had never quite left behind. It was a morning like any other when he arrived, grey, soft and thick with the scent of damp moss and river wind. The bells of St. Elred's had rung just after Lauds, their slow chime rolling over the hills with practised calm. The sisters were in the refectory, quietly breaking their fast with warm porridge and slices of dark bread, when the porter entered and bowed low to the abbess. "A rider had come," she whispered, bearing a letter from the bishop, and with it a request that a travelling cleric be granted temporary lodging while on ecclesiastical assignment in the region. This was not uncommon. The abbey, though cloistered, did not exist in complete isolation. From time to time, priests came to offer mass, scribes brought letters, abbots passed through with relics or requests. But this name, the name written on the letter's wax seal, was not just any name. Agnes recognized it before it was spoken aloud: Father Renatus. The name stirred something old, a flicker of memory. Her father had once praised him for a sermon delivered in Aachen, eloquent but not soft. Her brother had mentioned him in a letter just months earlier, describing him as a man of unusual insight and rhetorical talent. And now it seemed the man himself would cross the threshold of her quiet, walled world. He arrived before Sext. The gate opened with its usual creak, and the sisters, from behind their lattice screens, watched as the priest stepped through the arch. He was not young, but not old, perhaps in his late 30s. His hair was dark, streaked faintly with grey at the temples. His face bore the marks of long travel, tired eyes, a dust-lined cloak, but his bearing was alert, composed. He carried a small satchel, a travelling psalter, and a leather case bound with a gold clasp. A cleric, certainly, but also something else, something harder to name, a presence. The abbess greeted him with polite warmth. He bowed low, eyes downcast as protocol demanded. She led him to the guest chamber and informed the sisters at chapter that Father Renatus would be staying for several days, offering mass and confessions as needed, and conducting research for the bishop's chancery on local property deeds. His accommodations would be modest, his movements supervised, his access limited to permitted areas. Still, the presence of a man, especially one of reputation and voice, shifted the air in subtle ways. Agnes first saw him during Vespers. He stood behind the choir screen, just visible through the carved wood, his voice joining theirs in plainchant. Unlike other visitors who faltered in rhythm or tone, Renatus sang with precision, his Latin measured, his phrasing humble. He did not seek to outshine, but he did not hide. His voice blended, warm and assured. Agnes, her gaze lowered as always, felt the vibration of his baritone beneath her own breath, and for a moment her hand tightened on the psalter. The next day he heard confessions. Sisters came one by one to the parlour grill, their veils drawn, their voices soft. It was said afterward that he listened with rare patience, that he asked no probing questions, offered no judgment, only penance and prayers, spoken with care. When Agnes's turn came, she knelt on the wooden cushion, her heart steady, her voice rehearsed. She confessed minor frustrations, inattention, during matins, a sense of pride when praised for her singing, a flicker of envy toward a sister given new linens. He listened. Then, without haste, he said, "You are quick to see your shadows. But do you see your light?" She blinked. Silence hung. It was not the sort of response she expected. Not from a priest, not here. "I try not to think of myself at all," she replied carefully. "Perhaps," he said, "but that is not always the same as humility." She left unsettled. Over the days that followed, Father Renatus became a quiet presence in the abbey. He did not intrude. He walked the garden paths at permitted hours, spoke only when spoken to, and carried with him small scraps of parchment on which he occasionally jotted notes. But when he did speak, during meals when readings allowed, or in response to questions, his voice carried the weight of a man well versed in both scripture and metaphor. He spoke of St. Augustine, but cited Virgil. He quoted Bernard of Clairvaux, then paraphrased Ovid. His learning was broad, but never flaunted. The sisters listened, some puzzled, some quietly captivated. Agnes tried to maintain distance. She kept to her routines, buried herself in copying a Psalter manuscript, volunteered for the latrine rotation. But her thoughts wandered. She wondered what books were in his satchel, what prayers he recited at night, whether his rhetorical calm came from belief or mastery. The abbess, ever perceptive, called Agnes to her chambers one afternoon. "You knew of this priest before he came," she said, her voice not accusatory, merely observant. Agnes nodded. "By name. My brother mentioned him in correspondence." "Then let that be enough," the abbess replied gently. "Words can tether even the most devout hearts. Be watchful, sister." Agnes bowed. "Yes, Reverend Mother." But the warning came too late to undo what had already begun, not an affair, not a betrayal of vows, but a curiosity, a shift in attention, a presence that entered her thoughts during prayer and lingered when she folded linen. One evening, as the sun dipped low beyond the river bend, she encountered him unexpectedly in the herb garden. He had taken a wrong turn, he said, looking for the vestry. She offered a brief nod, gestured toward the path, and turned to leave. But he paused. "I saw your script," he said. "The Psalter copy. You have a careful hand." "It is practice," she replied without turning. "Practice is the beginning of everything," he murmured, "even faith." She left then, her heart beating faster than it should have. That night, she did not sleep easily. The days continued, quiet on the surface. But Agnes knew something had shifted, less in action than in atmosphere. They were two careful minds circling each other without touch or promise. He offered words. She responded with silence. And in that space, something grew. Dangerous. Beautiful. Unnamed. She told herself it was nothing. She reminded herself of her vows, but some part of her, long dormant, had awakened, not in rebellion, but in remembrance. That she was not just Sister Agnes, she was Agnes of Lotharingia, of thought, of desire, of unspent stories. And now a man of words had entered her cloister. It was not love, not at first. At least, that is what Agnes told herself. Love was something with shape, with form, a flame to be named, guarded, or extinguished. What passed between her and Father Renatus was something quieter, a current beneath the still waters of monastic routine, a glance, a word, a pause too long in passing, no rules broken outright, no vows defied in the open. And yet the rhythm of her life began to shift, imperceptibly at first, then steadily, like a candle burning unevenly in its holder. They saw each other only in permitted spaces, at chapel, in the garden, during shared meals when the abbess allowed readings to lapse. Yet, even in silence, they seemed to be in conversation. A nod at matins, a glance held for half a breath too long after Compline. In the sacred quiet of the refectory, their awareness of one another became its own form of communion. And it was words that drew them deeper. Renatus, ever a man of letters, left her a note. It was slipped inside a returned psalter, folded neatly between the leaves of the Psalms. A single line written in Latin but unmistakably intimate. Verba tua sicut mel sunt in faucibus meis. Your words are like honey upon my lips. It was from Scripture, yes, but it did not feel like Scripture. Agnes read it late at night, by the faintest flicker of her taper, and her hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from recognition. She should have burned it, reported it, confessed it. Instead, she folded it back into the book and tucked it beneath her mattress. More notes followed, always brief, always couched in religious language, references to saints who battled temptation, to mystics whose visions blurred the line between divine ecstasy and mortal desire. They never named what was blooming between them. They didn't have to. Agnes responded cautiously. A verse copied in elegant hand, a single line from Hildegard of Bingen, a margin note left in a borrowed volume. She convinced herself it was intellectual, spiritual, that it fed the mind, not the flesh. But the boundary was blurring, and the sisters began to notice. At first it was subtle, a glance held across the cloister walk, a slightly delayed response when her name was called, a softness in her voice during Mass. These were things that might pass unnoticed in the world beyond, but in the tightly wound stillness of a cloister, they echoed like footsteps in an empty corridor. Whispers began, soft, indirect, but pointed. A novice asked why Sister Agnes no longer sat beside her at study. An older sister remarked that Father Renatus seemed unusually interested in the scriptorium inventory. Someone noticed that the Psalter had not been returned to the communal shelf. The abbess said nothing, but her silence was not born of ignorance. It was the silence of observation. One evening, after Vespers, Agnes found another note. This one was longer, more personal. He wrote of dreams, of standing at the edge of a sea with her, of speaking without words, of longing not for her body, but for her presence. I have spent my life in service to God, he wrote, but I did not expect that God would speak to me through you. It was the closest he had come to naming it. She did not respond in writing, but the next morning she found herself walking through the herb garden earlier than usual. He was there, under the guise of collecting medicinal leaves. They spoke briefly, nothing improper. She asked about his studies. He asked about her scriptural commentary, but when she turned to leave, he said her name. Not sister, just Agnes. It stopped her. He did not say it again. He did not need to. That night, she lay awake, staring at the wooden beams of her cell. The candle had burned low. Her fingers traced the seam of her veil where it pressed against her brow. She felt both clarity and confusion. This was not a scandal in her mind, not yet. It was something suspended, weightless, waiting to tip one way or another. And yet she knew. She knew. Over the days that followed, her routines frayed. She stumbled during chant, missed a turning in the garden psalm, lost count of her rosary beads. Sisters who once sought her guidance now gave her space. The abbess remained calm, but her eyes, when they met Agnes's, held a question. Then came the night that changed everything. Agnes had gone to the cloister chapel for silent prayer, a permitted vigil after Compline. It was nearly empty, lit by a single oil lamp. She knelt beneath the painted crucifix, her hands folded, her thoughts adrift. He entered softly. She heard the rustle of his robes before she saw him. For a moment, neither moved. Then he stepped into the narrow beam of light and knelt beside her. They prayed, side by side, not touching, not speaking, but their silence spoke volumes. When he finally rose and left, he did not look back. And yet she felt as though he had said everything. The next morning, a sister approached the abbess. She had seen them. Nothing improper, she said, but it was not right. Not the way he looked at her. Not the way she trembled when he passed. The abbess listened without interruption, then dismissed the sister with a nod. The inquiry was swift and quiet. The abbess questioned Agnes gently but firmly. Had anything passed between them? Had vows been broken? Agnes, pale and composed, replied, "No, nothing had happened." But her voice wavered. That was enough. Father Renatus was summoned. He denied nothing, but confessed no wrongdoing. He was reassigned by the bishop's order within a fortnight, sent to a monastery 2 counties away for extended contemplation and reassignment. Agnes was not punished immediately, but things changed. She was removed from her scriptorium duties, assigned to the infirmary. Her letters were more closely monitored. Her cell was moved closer to the abbess's chambers, and though no official reprimand was issued, her place in the community shifted. Not with cruelty, but with distance. The whispers faded, replaced by quiet glances and polite detachment. She was still respected, still called sister, but a veil had been drawn, not over her face, but over her presence. She was no longer seen the same way. And perhaps, she thought, that was fitting, for she no longer saw herself the same way either. It was in the late weeks of Lent when the final unravelling came, a season of fasting, silence and introspection, perfect cover for the cold machinery of ecclesiastical correction. Spring stirred gently beyond the cloister walls, bringing the scent of thawed earth and early blossoms. But inside St. Elred's Abbey, the air was brittle with tension. Agnes had known something was shifting. The abbess had grown quieter in her presence, more formal. Her confessor's penances had lengthened, though spoken with compassion. The other sisters, while not unkind, had begun to speak around her rather than to her. The air was filled with absences of invitation, of warmth, of trust. But it wasn't until the parchment surfaced that everything collapsed. The letter, likely dropped by mistake or perhaps left deliberately, was discovered by Sister Gertrude, the infirmarian. Folded between the pages of a devotional manual in the cloister library, it bore no signature, but the hand was unmistakable. It was one of Renatus's, penned in his slanted Latin, addressed simply, "To she who prays with the eyes of fire." It was poetic, veiled in scriptural imagery, but the intimacy was undeniable. "I carry the echo of your silence in every psalm I sing," it read. "When I kneel, I remember your breath beside me." That was enough. The abbess convened a quiet chapter meeting that evening, without Agnes present. 3 senior sisters were consulted. The bishop's representative, Father Hildebert, a severe man with a hawk's stare, was sent for. Within 2 days, the cloister was no longer a sanctuary, it had become a tribunal. Agnes was called to the refectory, which had been cleared of its benches and transformed into a temporary court. She stood before the abbess, flanked by 2 veiled sisters, with Father Hildebert seated at a simple wooden desk. The letter was placed before her. "Do you recognize this?" the abbess asked gently. Agnes looked at the parchment, then nodded once. "Did you write any response?" asked Hildebert, his voice even but sharp. "No," she said truthfully. "Did you meet with this man outside permitted times?" A pause. "No," she said, but it was barely a whisper. Hildebert leaned back. "Did you give your heart to him?" Agnes hesitated. There was no rule in the rule of Saint Benedict that accounted for the heart alone. She looked up, her gaze steady now. "I prayed with him," she said. "I listened. I felt seen." "That is not an answer," Hildebert snapped, but the abbess raised a hand. "It is the only answer she can give," she said softly. The verdict was not dramatic. There was no excommunication, no public branding. The Church preferred discretion, especially with noble-born sisters. Instead, a set of private penances was issued. She was to be removed from all duties involving the copying of scripture or the teaching of novices. She was to fast an additional day each week for a season. She was to speak only when spoken to outside of liturgical hours, and most painful of all, she was to be forbidden from receiving communion for 40 days. For a nun, that was no small thing. To be barred from the Eucharist was not just a punishment, it was a message that her soul was not in full communion with the body of Christ, that she had placed someone between herself and God. She accepted the sentence without protest, but what came after was harder than she had anticipated. The days passed slowly. Her silence, once chosen, now felt like a cage. The work she was assigned, cleaning the novices' dormitory, gathering refuse from the garden, boiling linens, was simple but isolating. She no longer shared in the rhythm of the sisters' chants. She no longer knelt in the same row. And even when penance passed and she was returned to communion, the change did not reverse. She had become a shadow in the house she once helped guide. The sisters were not cruel, but their glances lingered, their silences deepened. Even those who once looked to her for counsel now hesitated. She was no longer a pillar of the community. She was a story, a warning. One evening after supper, she sat alone in the cloister walk, listening to the wind tug at the ivy vines. The stars had begun to appear, pale and trembling above the roofline. She traced a crack in the stone bench with her finger, over and over. She thought of Renatus, not with longing, but with sorrow. He had been sent away quietly. The bishop's letter said nothing of punishment, only of reassignment. It was likely he had returned to monastic life, to a scriptory or a parish where no one knew her name. Perhaps he prayed for her. Perhaps he did not. She prayed for him, though, every night. Not with desire, not with hope, but with forgiveness. She prayed that he had found peace, wherever he was, that he had not been devoured by the same loneliness she now felt clinging to her bones. And she prayed that one day she might return to the stillness she once knew. Not the stillness of ignorance, but of acceptance, of integration, of grace. The abbess, to her credit, never turned away. She offered no special comfort, but neither did she withdraw her gaze. In time she invited Agnes to read at Lord's once more. A small mercy, a beginning. But Agnes knew that the old life, her former place in the abbey, was gone. She had crossed a line, even if only in thought and word, and that crossing had marked her, not as fallen, but as human. It was not called exile. The letter from the diocesan office used more graceful words: transfer, contemplative retreat, reassignment for renewal. But to Agnes the meaning was unmistakable. Her time at St. Elred's had come to a quiet end. After more than a decade within those stone walls where she had been veiled, praised, and later shunned, she was being sent away, not in disgrace, not officially, but not in honour either. The new priory lay far to the west, nestled in the thick forests beyond the river Saone. It was a modest place, smaller and poorer than St. Elred's, housing only a dozen sisters, most of them aging and infirm. No scriptory, no formal school, just prayer, silence, and soil. It was a place where reputations faded like footprints in snow. Agnes departed quietly, without ceremony. The abbess gave her a blessing before she left, hands placed gently on her veiled head, a prayer spoken low and slow. The other sisters watched from the cloister walk, their faces mostly unreadable. A few nodded. One, the youngest novice, wept silently. No words were exchanged, none were needed. The road to the priory was long and winding, and as the cart moved through fog-draped valleys and groves of linden trees, Agnes stared out at the blurred landscape, hands clasped in her lap. Her trunk held little, just a psalter, a hairbrush carved from yew, a folded blanket gifted by the infirmarian. She had asked for nothing more. At the new priory, life moved in slow, aching rhythms. The building itself was humble, weathered stones mottled with moss, roofs patched with wooden shingles. The chapel leaned slightly to the left. The garden was overgrown. The sisters greeted her with kindness but not curiosity. They did not ask why she had come. They did not want to know. Agnes, for her part, offered no explanation. She took to her duties with quiet resolve. Rising before dawn, she tended to the herb beds, fetched water from the well, helped Sister Heloise prepare bread for the altar. There were no classes to teach, no psalters to copy, just work, prayer, and the occasional delivery of cheese or honey to a passing monk. The silence suited her. Here there were no whispers, no expectations, no legacy, and in that stillness she began to listen, first to the sounds of the forest around her, the rustle of leaves, the soft padding of foxes, the crackle of frost beneath her shoes in early spring, then to her own thoughts. It was strange at first to hear her own inner voice so clearly. For years it had been layered beneath routine and responsibility. Now it rose like smoke from incense, drifting, uncertain, yet strangely pure. She thought often of St. Elred's, not with longing, not even with grief, but with a kind of removed tenderness, like remembering a home from childhood. Not the pain, not the joys, but the shape of the doorway, the feel of the floor under bare feet. She imagined the sisters moving through their day without her, the novices she once guided now teaching others. The abbess, aged and steadier, kneeling at the same wooden bench. She thought too of Renatus. Less often as the months passed, but still with clarity. She never learned what had become of him. Perhaps he had found another post, or faded into scholarly obscurity, pouring himself into commentary on the prophets. Perhaps he had buried the memory of her beneath new assignments, or perhaps, though she tried not to imagine it, he had remembered her quietly in his own prayers. She did not hold anger toward him, nor did she feel betrayed. What they had shared, whatever it had truly been, was not passion, not possession. It had been presence, a moment of human recognition in a place where such moments were rare. And though it had cost her nearly everything, she did not regret it. There were seasons of deep peace at the priory. Autumns when the maple trees flamed crimson, and she walked beneath them with arms full of drying herbs. Winters when the snow fell in sheets and the sisters gathered close to the hearth, knitting quietly in the glow of fading coals. Springs when crocuses broke through frozen earth and her fingers tingled with the cold of early weeding. Summers when the forest hummed and she could almost forget the sound of bells. Over time, she became known among the sisters as a source of calm. They sought her out in small ways, a touch on the sleeve, a shared task, a request for help, translating an old hymn. No one asked about her past, and in that mercy she found restoration. She kept her vows with renewed intention, not out of fear or duty or the need for redemption, but out of quiet choice. She had lost her place once. She had found another, not better, not worse, just simpler, more real. Years passed. Her hair turned silver at the temples. Her hands grew stiff from morning frost. Her eyesight faded slightly, and she read now with a larger candle. But she never stopped rising early, never stopped kneeling for prayer, never stopped listening to the stillness. When she died, it was on a spring morning, with birdsong slipping in through the cracked shutters of her cell. She was found seated upright in her chair, hands folded over her psalter, lips parted slightly, as if she had just finished whispering the last verse of the day. Her burial was modest, a linen shroud, a wooden cross, no titles, no mention of the life before, and yet, in the years that followed, sisters would speak of her. They remembered her kindness, her precision in prayer, the way she never raised her voice, never hurried her steps, never turned away from labor. They did not know her full story. They did not know the noble name she once bore, or the priest whose letters once stirred her soul. But they remembered her peace, and in that remembrance her name lived on, not in scandal, not in shame, but in quiet echo. A life once unravelled, then mended, then laid to rest. It began with a cough, then a fainting spell, a whispered accusation. A nun in her early 20s, quiet, pious, largely unnoticed, fell into spasms during evening prayers in the convent of the Ursulines in Loudun. Her limbs jerked violently, her eyes rolled upward, and she gasped, eyes wide, claiming a presence stood beside her, a shadow she could not name. The other sisters gathered around her, murmuring prayers. At first, they thought it was illness, but then another nun fell, then another. And within days the entire choir was overcome. It was the 1630s by the calendar, but the beliefs that governed these women, and the church that encircled them, were rooted in centuries of earlier medieval tradition. Though this incident in Loudun occurred in early modern France, it was a product of a worldview inherited from the High Middle Ages, where possession was not simply possible, it was feared, expected, and, most critically, interpreted. The nuns of Loudun became infamous for their apparent demonic affliction. They barked like dogs. They claimed to see devils perched on rafters. They tore at their clothes, rolled on the floor, screamed in Latin and tongues no one could understand. Witnesses said their voices grew deeper, inhuman. One nun claimed she had been forced into a midnight marriage with Lucifer himself. Another said a priest had cast a love spell on her, summoning spirits through unholy rites. To an outsider, it might have seemed theatrical, even absurd. But within the cloister, these events were deadly serious. The abbess sought help from the church hierarchy. The bishop responded swiftly. An exorcist was summoned. The girls were questioned repeatedly, publicly, and often in the presence of local officials and nobles who came as though to a play. And at the heart of the accusations a scapegoat emerged, Urbain Grandier, a priest known for his eloquence, his vanity, and his political enemies. Grandier was arrested, tortured, and eventually burned at the stake, convicted of witchcraft and diabolic manipulation. He denied it to the end. Some believed he was innocent, others were certain he had consorted with dark forces. But for the nuns, many of whom collapsed weeping or screaming at the sight of him, it didn't matter. Their affliction had found a shape, a name, a story. But Loudun was not unique. These episodes of collective possession were not confined to one region or one century. They occurred across Europe, in Germany, Spain, the Low Countries, and England, particularly within female monastic communities. Often they followed similar patterns: isolation, fasting, emotional stress, and then a triggering event, a sickness, a dream, a controversial new visitor. And slowly the boundary between ritual and reality began to blur. Imagine for a moment the world these women lived in. Behind high walls and thick stone, they lived by bells. The same prayers repeated daily, the same meals taken in silence, the same scriptures copied and sung and meditated upon in endless rotation. Their families were far away, their futures already written. The rule dictated when they rose, when they slept, when they spoke, and when they were allowed to confess. In this quiet, ordered world, the inner self was often the only space left to move. Desires, doubts, and fears had no outlet. And into that interior landscape, thoughts could twist, dreams could become revelations, guilt could be mistaken for voices, longing could take the shape of a demon at the end of the bed. Some scholars believe that these possessions were, in part, psychological responses to repression and monotony. That the nuns, denied agency and expression, experienced intense hallucinations or entered trance states as a form of emotional release. Others argue that the possessions were social phenomena, performances unconsciously adopted and magnified by suggestion and expectation. Once one nun succumbed, the others followed, unwillingly or not, into the script. But that does not mean they were faking. What the possessed experienced was real to them. Their bodies reacted, their speech changed. They sweat, screamed and cried. And the fear they felt of devils, of hell, of disappointing God was not invented. It was cultivated. They had been taught from girlhood that evil was waiting, always watching, always hungry for the weak of faith. The devil was not abstract, he was personal, and the church too had its script. Once possession was named, exorcism followed, rituals involving prayers, holy water, relics, and often, though not officially sanctioned, physical restraint. In some cases, the exorcisms were daily performances watched by townspeople who gathered outside the convent gates, eager for a glimpse of the drama. What began as a spiritual crisis became a public spectacle. Back inside, the nuns lived in an atmosphere thick with incense and suspicion. Every cough, every twitch, every sigh could be read as evidence of possession, and so they began to internalize the role, some reluctantly, others with fervor. They fasted more, prayed harder, screamed louder, and at the center of it all, a strange power emerged. For once in their lives, they were not invisible. They were seen. Their voices, which had been confined to chants and recitations, now commanded rooms. Their experiences, no matter how painful, were validated by priests, bishops, even kings. In a society that muted female agency, possession was, paradoxically, one of the few roles where a woman's interior life was acknowledged as meaningful. But it was also dangerous. Some possessed nuns were locked away, others were declared heretics, and when their stories threatened the church's image, they were quietly silenced, transferred, punished, or simply forgotten. The story of possession was only tolerated so long as it served the needs of the institution. In Loudun, the spectacle ended with fire. But in other convents, the stories simply faded. The possessed were quietly healed. The afflicted were reabsorbed into the daily rhythm. A new novice arrived, a different priest was assigned, and the community moved on, burying the past beneath more psalms. For the nuns, though, the experience lingered. Some carried shame. Others, a kind of strange pride. Many were never the same. Their cells, once places of quiet, now held echoes. Their bodies remembered what their minds could not explain. Even centuries later, historians piecing through convent archives find not only the dramatic testimonies but also the quiet margins, notes written in trembling hands, confessions stricken through, entries that end mid-sentence, as though the truth was too strange to finish. Today we might see these women as victims of repression, or as accidental performers, or as believers swept into the storm of their own inner worlds. But whatever lens we use, the nuns' stories demand more than curiosity. They demand listening, not for horror, not for scandal, but for the human voice trembling beneath the ritual, the desire perhaps not to be possessed, but simply to be heard. In the dim candlelight of a medieval infirmary, a nun might have sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, as the convent's healer examined her pale skin for signs of imbalance. Perhaps she had complained of a heaviness in her chest, or a heat in her belly, or dreams too vivid to speak aloud. The healer, herself likely a sister trained more by observation than book, might have nodded gravely and murmured that her humours were stirred, that too much heat had risen in her blood, or perhaps her womb had begun to wander. It sounds strange to us now, the idea that a woman's womb could become untethered, travel through the body, pressing upon lungs or brain, creating symptoms of madness or despair. And yet, for many centuries, that belief shaped how women were understood, especially within cloistered spaces. In the medical texts of antiquity carried through the Islamic world and translated into Latin in the monasteries of Europe, the female body was framed not as a stable vessel, but as an unstable element, moist, porous, closer to nature than to reason. To be a woman was, in a sense, to be perpetually in danger of being overtaken by biology, by emotion, by spirits, or by sin. And for a woman who had taken vows, this danger was compounded by the demand for purity. The Church, particularly after the 12th century, had become increasingly fixated on sexual morality. Virginity was exalted not merely as a personal choice, but as a holy state, an imitation of Mary, a renunciation of Eve. The female saints most praised were those who had resisted marriage, fled their homes, and mutilated themselves rather than submit to earthly love. Their stories were retold with reverence, and the message echoed in every homily. The body was a battlefield, and women must be warriors. But not all women were saints. Most were ordinary. And even cloistered, they were not immune to the pressures of biology and longing. Their bodies still bled, their skin still warmed, their dreams still carried the echoes of touch, of companionship, of voices long past. In this tension between the Church's ideal and the body's reality, many found themselves quietly unravelling. Some nuns reported sensations they could not name, a burning in the limbs, a shadow pressing on the chest at night, thoughts that came unbidden during prayer. They confessed to their spiritual directors who might warn them of the devil's whispers. They fasted, scourged themselves, clutched cold iron to chase away heat. And when these failed, when their symptoms worsened, they were declared afflicted, possessed, but not always by demons in the traditional sense. In many cases, their possession was simply the Church's label for something deeper, sadder, more human. The expression of a mind and body caught in contradiction. A woman who screamed during prayer might be deemed sinful. A woman who laughed too loudly in the cloister might be suspected of being tempted. A woman who withdrew, trembling during the laying on of hands, might be seen as resisting holiness, when perhaps all she resisted was the intimacy of touch she had not chosen. Medieval theology had little patience for ambiguity. It preferred binaries, sacred or profane, virgin or whore, angel or witch. But the truth of the human body, especially the female body, was never so clear. And so the Church crafted explanations. If a nun wept without cause, it was the devil trying to distract her. If she swooned in chapel, she was under assault from impure spirits. If she desired too deeply, even in thought, it was a sign that she had opened the door to darkness. The body, in this worldview, was not a friend. It was something to be subdued, and nowhere was this fear more pronounced than within the convent walls, where women lived entirely in female company without the protection of male oversight, and where rumours of sapphic intimacy, carnal dreams, or spiritual ecstasies constantly walked the edge of acceptability. When a nun cried out at night, she might be tended gently by her sisters, or she might be reported. The line between care and control was thin. Sometimes the fear of the body led to extreme remedies, fasting until one fainted, sleeping on boards instead of mattresses, refusing water for days to punish the tongue for wandering thoughts. These were not punishments imposed by others, but chosen, embraced even by the women themselves as acts of purification. Yet these efforts could not erase the truth. Even in silence, even in prayer, the body persisted. It itched, it ached, it remembered. And as the years passed in the dim halls of the convent, with little stimulation and less sunlight, the mind could begin to fray. Visions appeared, faces in the dark, breathless panic. And in that moment of collapse, when the boundaries between self and world gave way, the church had a name ready: possession. But what if instead we named it loneliness? What if we saw these women not as portals for devils, but as people trapped between holiness and humanity? There is a tenderness in imagining them that way, not as sinners, not as mad women, but as deeply sensitive souls caught in the vice of a theology that feared the very thing that made them human, their bodies. Today we know more about hormones, trauma, isolation, and mental health. We understand how repression can twist inward, how unspoken thoughts can break the silence like thunder. But in their time, there were no such tools, only faith, only shame, only the whisper that perhaps they had been chosen by God or by the devil. And so they fought themselves again and again beneath the veil and behind the walls. Not always to win, but simply to endure. Her cell was small, stone-walled, with a wooden door that creaked when opened, and a single window no larger than a hand's breadth. It let in very little light, and most days Agnes imagined it more as a slit in the world than a portal to it. Outside she could hear the wind brushing across the cloister walk, the rustle of robes during prayer processions, and sometimes the soft cooing of doves on the chapel roof. But inside, the cell was quiet. Too quiet. It was in that quiet that the voices began. They didn't come all at once. The first time it was little more than a whisper, a breath that did not belong to her own body, a rustle at the edge of the dark. She had been fasting that week, preparing for the feast of St. Clare. Her stomach ached, and her limbs trembled whenever she knelt for too long. The hunger was a kind of clarity, the sisters said. It sharpened the soul. But for Agnes, it also sharpened the shadows. One night, just after Compline, she returned to her cell and found the candle already lit. She didn't remember leaving it burning. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the flickering light stretch across the stone walls, elongating her shadow into something alien. The air felt heavy, as though someone had just exhaled. She entered slowly. Nothing was disturbed. Her bed was made, her psalter folded neatly beside it. And yet her heart pounded as if she had been running. She whispered a prayer, then another. She lay down, drawing the thin blanket up to her chin, and closed her eyes. The whisper came again, this time closer, clearer. It said her name, Agnes. She sat bolt upright, breath caught in her throat. The candle had gone out. In the days that followed, she told no one. She prayed more fervently. She added extra hours of silence. She fasted beyond what was required, and still, at night, the presence returned. Sometimes it was a pressure on her chest, her throat, the base of her spine. Other times it was a scent, like burning herbs or spoiled oil. On one occasion, she claimed she had seen a shadow moving beneath her bed. When she reached for her crucifix, it was gone, only to be found the next morning, laid carefully on the windowsill. Eventually, she confessed. Not to the abbess, but to her spiritual director, a visiting priest assigned to hear confessions during Lent. He listened quietly as she recounted her experiences. When she finished, He asked her a single question. Had she felt pleasure during these encounters? The question stunned her. Pleasure? She thought of the thrill that had accompanied the fear, the warmth that had followed the whispers. She didn't know how to answer. The priest said nothing more. He gave her penance, 3 days of silence, no food but bread and water, and 40 recitations of the Ave Maria. She obeyed, but the silence, the fasting, only made the voices louder. It was not uncommon in the medieval cloister for spiritual experiences to blend with the physical. Many women reported feeling the presence of Christ embracing them, kissing their wounds, entering their bodies in mystical union. Saints were known to bleed from invisible stigmata or collapse in fits of ecstatic vision. The line between divine visitation and personal longing was often drawn only after the fact, depending on how the community interpreted the outcome. If a nun grew more devout, her experience was hailed as holy. If she grew erratic or hysterical, it was declared demonic. Agnes, unfortunately, belonged to the latter camp. As the weeks went on, her behavior became harder to ignore. She often arrived late to the refectory, eyes wide and darting. She flinched when others touched her. Once, during Lauds, she screamed in the middle of a chant. The other sisters froze. The abbess did not speak. But the next day, Agnes was reassigned to manual labor, scrubbing floors, washing linens, tasks designed to exhaust the body and cleanse the mind. She did not resist. In fact, she seemed relieved. The physicality of the work grounded her. Her hands found rhythm in the repetitive motion. Her thoughts stilled. For a time, the presence retreated. But then came the dream. In it, she stood in the chapel, alone. The crucifix above the altar began to bleed, and the blood pooled at her feet. From the shadows, a figure emerged, not horned, not monstrous, but familiar. He spoke her name. He said he had always been there, that he had waited, that she belonged to him now. She awoke weeping. She told no one, but she began to speak to the presence, not aloud, not in prayer, but in thought. It was not affection she felt, nor fear, but companionship. In a life of restriction, of unchanging days and unyielding rules, the presence felt like a secret, a piece of herself no one could reach. It listened when no one else did. It understood what she could not say. She began to write down her experiences. She kept a small journal hidden beneath the rush mat under her bed. In it, she described the sensations, the warmth, the pressure, the whispers. She never named the presence as the devil. But she didn't name it as Christ either. She simply called it the other. Eventually, the journal was found. It was during a routine cleaning of the cells. A novice discovered it while changing the rushes and handed it to the sub-prioress. From there, it made its way to the abbess. Within hours, Agnes was summoned. She was not punished, not yet, but she was placed under spiritual observation. Her confessions were to be taken daily. Her cell was to be inspected regularly. She was to be accompanied at all times. The whispers stopped. The presence disappeared. And with it, something inside Agnes faded. She grew quieter, smaller. Her eyes no longer darted in fear. Her hands moved mechanically through her duties. She spoke only when spoken to. The journal was never returned. She never asked for it. The abbess, in her final report to the bishop, wrote that Sister Agnes had passed through a season of temptation, but emerged subdued and penitent. No mention was made of possession, no exorcism was performed. The matter was considered closed, but Agnes knew differently. In the solitude of her cell, stripped of books and privacy, she would sit at night, and listened to the silence, not for voices, but for herself, for whatever part of her had awakened during those strange, fevered weeks. It was gone now, or buried. She never claimed possession again, but she also never smiled. The devil in the cell had been silenced, but the woman remained, unsure if she had been saved or merely emptied. In the deepest hours of the night, when the last candle had guttered and only the sound of wind moved through the cloister halls, some nuns claimed to see things not meant for waking eyes. A figure, brilliant and veiled in gold, hovering near the crucifix. A voice like honey pouring from the rafters. A sudden pressure in the chest, not painful, but unbearable in its intensity. These were not dreams, they insisted. They were visitations. The medieval world was steeped in such visions. Saints and mystics often described overwhelming bodily experiences, voices, lights, even spiritual marriages. Catherine of Siena spoke of receiving the heart of Christ inside her chest. Hildegard of Bingen heard music no one else could hear and recorded it in trembling script. These were not metaphors, but lived encounters, experiences that blurred the lines between divine ecstasy and physical rapture. But not all visions were welcomed. When a nun cried out during midnight prayers, claiming to see the Virgin wrapped in flame, the sisters might call her blessed, or they might question whether the devil had taken a pleasing disguise. When another collapsed during Eucharist, whispering that Christ had spoken directly into her ear, the priest might be summoned to verify her claim or warn her of pride. The distinction between holiness and heresy was a matter of context, interpretation, and timing. Imagine, for a moment, the stillness of a convent chapel at dusk, the amber light falling in long ribbons through stained glass, the scent of wax and damp stone. A sister kneels, hands clasped tightly, her lips murmuring verses she's recited thousands of times. Her stomach is empty, her sleep has been thin, her mind, overburdened by self-scrutiny and longing, begins to drift. And then, clarity. A figure behind her closed eyes, a warmth rising from her chest, flooding her limbs, tears, trembling, a sense of being watched. No, not watched, held. In this moment, is she hallucinating, praying, or transcending? For many medieval women, these experiences were the closest they came to intimacy, to the ecstatic. In a world where their bodies were controlled, their speech limited, and their desires redirected into devotion, such moments were treasured, even as they frightened. A vision of Christ was not just spiritual. It was also emotional, and sometimes deeply sensual. Therein lay the Church's discomfort. When Teresa of Avila described an angel piercing her heart with a flaming spear, she wrote that the pain was so sweet, so consuming, that she moaned aloud. The pain was not bodily, she insisted, but the soul enjoys it. Her face, captured centuries later by Bernini in marble, is one of pure abandon. Eyes half closed, lips parted, a saint, yes, but also a woman overwhelmed. Theologians debated these accounts endlessly. Were they proof of divine favor or signs of madness? The line between mystic and heretic was razor thin. If a vision produced humility, self-denial, and greater obedience, it was accepted. If it led to disobedience, pride, or emotional instability, it was condemned. The very same symptoms, rapture, weeping, convulsions, could be read as saintly or satanic, depending on the outcome. And for the women themselves, there was no safe way to know. Those who experienced such ecstasies often felt ashamed. They would hide their visions, speak of them only in confession, or deny them altogether. Some feared they were losing their minds. Others feared the attention such claims would bring, admiration from some, suspicion from others. One nun wrote in her private journal that during a fast, she felt a radiant hand upon her cheek. She opened her eyes. No one was there, but the warmth lingered. That night, she wept, not from joy, but confusion. Had God touched her? Or had her mind conjured comfort where none existed? Another wrote of being pursued in dreams by an angel who looked like the man she once loved before taking vows. He offered her lilies. She woke up with her hands curled around empty air. She said nothing for weeks. In some cases, the ecstasies escalated. Women collapsed in chapel. They spoke in languages they had never studied. They recited entire psalms backward. They trembled violently during Mass. Sometimes they screamed the name of Christ, other times the name of something darker. The Church often responded with scrutiny. Spiritual advisors were assigned. Confessions became more frequent. Diaries were confiscated. Some women were moved to stricter convents. Others were exorcised, but very few were listened to. The idea that a woman could experience God in her body was threatening because it bypassed the structure of priesthood, ritual, and doctrine. If a nun claimed divine communication, what need was there for mediation? And yet, despite the risk, the visions continued, because the need that birthed them was real. The need to feel something beyond the stone and silence. The need to be seen, not as a soul awaiting judgment, but as a human being hungry for touch, for presence, for transcendence. Over time, the Church codified acceptable forms of mysticism. Women were encouraged to write only under supervision. Visions had to conform to doctrine. Ecstasies were praised if they led to piety, condemned if they led to disquiet. But the experiences themselves could not be legislated. They came, often unbidden, in the stillness of cells. In the long nights between vigils, in the aching hours of hunger and hope. Were they delusions? Perhaps. But they were also real, at least to the women who lived them. And in the end, that is what matters most, not whether the visions were divine, but whether they gave comfort in the darkness, whether they allowed the heart to breathe in a world that so often silenced it, whether just for a moment they let the soul rise. They came with incense and holy water, with crucifixes raised high and candles lit low. Sometimes they entered in silence, robed in somber black. Other times, with chants echoing ahead of them, swinging thuribles that filled the air with sharp clouds of frankincense. Wherever they arrived, the air changed, not just in scent, but in tension. The exorcists had come. The presence of an exorcist within a convent was a serious matter, but it was rarely quiet. For all its solemnity, an exorcism was not a private ritual. It was a performance, a stage set within cloister walls. And every nun, every sister, every novice became both witness and participant. Often the arrival followed weeks of mounting incidents, whispers of unexplainable behavior, sisters who screamed in the night, rosaries torn from walls, psalters discovered defaced. At first, it might be attributed to stress, fasting, even seasonal illness, but when prayers failed and disturbances grew, the abbess would contact the bishop, and the bishop, concerned more for public perception than pastoral care, would send the Church's most dramatic solution: the exorcist. He was usually a priest of some repute, not always local, sometimes from another diocese entirely. Someone trained not only in the rites of exorcism, but in the subtle art of persuasion, of navigating superstition, belief, and fear with calculated force. Before he even stepped foot into the chapel, word would spread. Townspeople would linger near the outer gates. Servants whispered behind closed doors. Even secular officials might appear, curious to observe. In a time when theatre was scarce and drama rare, an exorcism promised spectacle, and few turned away. Inside, preparations were made. The afflicted nun was separated, confined to her cell, or to the infirmary, where her behavior could be monitored. A simple cross was placed at the foot of her bed. Psalms were recited hourly. Food was minimal. She was instructed to pray constantly. Sometimes she was not allowed to sleep. Exhaustion, it was believed, made the demon easier to dislodge. When the ritual began, it followed the Roman rite, formal, structured invocations in Latin. The priest would hold the crucifix toward the afflicted and demand the demon to name itself. He would call on the archangels, on the saints, on the Virgin. Holy water would be sprinkled, often generously. The sign of the cross made again and again. But what truly unfolded in these moments was often less about theology and more about theatre. The afflicted would writhe, scream, speak in strange voices, cry out names long buried in the cloister's history. They might insult the priest, recount secrets never told aloud, or shout fragments of scripture in reverse. Their voices would deepen, their faces contort. It was spectacle, yes, but it was also real, at least to them. And in the audience, because that's what it became, the other sisters watched, some with pity, some with doubt, others with dread, because in the shifting candlelight it was all too easy to imagine themselves in that bed, caught in that convulsion, weeping as the prayers rang out. The exorcist, meanwhile, maintained control, his voice steady, his rhythm practiced. He was part priest, part actor, part judge. And if the afflicted collapsed, suddenly peaceful, he declared victory. The demon had fled. God had triumphed. The abbey was safe. But it didn't always end so cleanly. Sometimes the symptoms returned. Sometimes they spread. One nun falling ill, then another. The exorcist would have to return, or he might declare the possession false, a trick of the mind, or worse, a lie. In those cases, the woman might be punished, isolated, or even accused of witchcraft, because if the possession was not real, it was heresy, and if it was real but unhealed, it was dangerous. In Laudun, the infamous 17th century case often looked to as a model, the exorcisms stretched on for months. The nuns' convulsions were copied and described in writing. Their cries became folklore. One nun's vision accused a local priest of summoning demons through enchanted bouquets and Latin charms. He was arrested, tortured, and ultimately executed, burned at the stake before a crowd that cheered and prayed in equal measure. That was the political side of possession. It wasn't always about the nun. It was about the abbess who needed to preserve her convent's reputation, about the bishop who feared scandal, about a church desperately clinging to moral authority in an age where its foundations were increasingly questioned. The nuns, trembling in their beds, voices hoarse from days of crying, became tools in this dance, not intentionally, not maliciously, but inevitably. Their suffering became a currency, their affliction a message. If they recovered, it was proof of divine power. If they didn't, it was proof of sin. But either way, the lesson was clear. Silence your doubts, your desires, your dreams. Stay within the walls, stay within the rules. And what of the nuns themselves once the rituals ended? Some claimed to remember nothing. Others described peace, true or feigned. A few were never the same, withdrawn, unreachable, their eyes distant, their voices dimmed. Rarely were they believed. Even more rarely were they helped. The exorcist would leave, the townsfolk would drift home. The abbey would resume its rhythm. Bells, chants, meals, silence. The wound, unspoken, yet it lingered. In the hallway where the cries once echoed, in the cell where the candles had burned too long, in the pages of a report, sealed and sent to the bishop, filed away and forgotten. Today, these events are studied in classrooms, debated in books. Were the nuns delusional, possessed, victims of repression, of mass hysteria, of faith too deep and bodies too fragile? The answers are many, none simple, but within the ritual, beyond the chants and the incense, was always a woman, frightened, hungry, lonely, trying to make sense of her world, and perhaps, just perhaps, trying to be heard. Centuries have passed since the last documented mass possession of cloistered nuns. The bells that once summoned the sisters to prayer now hang silent in ruined abbeys or restored museums. The cells where women once wept in fear and fever are empty, some reduced to stone outlines, others remodeled into monastic retreats for the curious and the devout. Time has worn away the immediacy of those events, but the questions remain. When we look back with modern eyes, what do we see? Not demons, not witches, not unholy forces swirling through the cloisters, but something quieter, more human. Beneath the rituals and rhetoric, beneath the pages of ecclesiastical reports and the scrawled confessions of the afflicted, we find the soft, persistent pulse of pain, of longing, of repression. We find trauma, not the word they would have used, of course. In the Middle Ages, there was no language for psychological injury, no framework to name the effects of spiritual pressure, bodily denial, or the emotional violence of confinement. A nun who wept uncontrollably or collapsed during Mass might be said to suffer from melancholia, a black bile of the soul, or else she was considered possessed, or sinful, or both. But what we now understand through the careful work of historians, theologians, and psychologists is that these episodes often carried the hallmarks of dissociation, of internalized fear, of minds stretched to the breaking point by silence, celibacy, and spiritual expectation. Trauma, as we define it today, is not always born of war or sudden violence. Sometimes it grows slowly, like moss, in the quiet places, in the spaces where a person is not allowed to be fully themselves, in cells with no mirrors, in hours marked by bells and prayers when no one asks what you feel, only whether you have sinned. For many medieval nuns, life was not cruel. It was devout, orderly, and meaningful. The convent could be a haven from a brutal world, a place of books, of music, of female companionship. And for some, it was enough. More than enough. But for others, the walls closed in. Desire, fear, and identity had no language within the cloister. A woman who experienced strange dreams or inexplicable pain, who heard voices or lost time, had nowhere to turn except her own theology. And within that theology, the enemy was clear. If you suffered, it was because Satan had found a way in. And so possession became a story they could live with. A terrifying one, but a comprehensible one. Because the alternative, that the pain came from within, that it was woven into their very selves, was unthinkable. To say that trauma replaced possession would be too simple. The truth is layered, cultural, spiritual, and emotional. What they experienced was not fake, nor staged, nor, in every case, delusional. It was real, constructed from the materials their world gave them, saints and demons, angels and sin, purity and fall. They suffered honestly, and in their suffering they sought meaning. Modern clinicians who study historical cases often note how closely certain symptoms of demonic possession resemble what we now call conversion disorders, hysteria, PTSD, even epilepsy. And yet the diagnoses we use today are no more compassionate if we forget the lives behind them. Labels cannot replace listening. What if, instead of diagnosing, we bore witness, not just to the spectacle of possession, but to the slow ache beneath it, to the isolation of women cut off from the world, to the exhaustion of being watched, judged, and expected to embody spiritual perfection, to the silence they were expected to keep, even as their minds and bodies cried out in dissonance. There is a tenderness in viewing the possessed nun not as a case study, but as a person, someone who may have joined the convent at 14, having never chosen the veil, who missed her mother's voice, who remembered the sound of birds in her childhood garden, who fasted not just because it was holy, but because she wanted to disappear, and who, one night, felt a presence she could not name. We must not romanticize their suffering, nor diminish the seriousness of the rituals they underwent, but we can honor their experience by seeing it clearly through the shadows cast by time, through the distortions of doctrine, and finding the woman who knelt in that stone cell, eyes wide in the dark. Even now, she is not alone. Her story lingers in the records, in the cracked bindings of monastic ledgers, in marginalia scribbled in nervous hands. A name, a date, a note. Sister Agnes reports visions again. We do not know what she saw, but we can imagine what she felt. And in doing so, we extend her what the Church could not: understanding, gentleness. And finally, rest. The door closed softly behind her, the echoes swallowed by thick stone walls. Once inside, silence was no longer a suggestion. It was a commandment, a presence that lived in the cloister like a spirit of its own. For the women who entered religious life in the Middle Ages, silence was not merely golden, it was structural, built into the very architecture of the convent. Thick walls, narrow windows, tightly controlled movement. A boundary not just between the sacred and the secular, but between what was known and what must never be spoken. In theory, the cloister was a sanctuary, a space to retreat from the distractions and dangers of the world. Here, a woman could devote herself wholly to God, far from the noise of markets, the threat of war, or the burden of family expectations. And in many cases, it was a true refuge. There were nuns who found peace, who found learning, who found community in those quiet corridors. But there was another side, less visible, less recorded, but equally real. Convents, like all institutions, had their shadows. Shame was a difficult thing to carry in a place where everyone watched, but no one spoke. The rhythms of monastic life were designed for scrutiny. Nuns rose together, prayed together, ate together, slept in rows. They were rarely alone. Every movement had a meaning, every deviation was noticed, but the response was not always confrontation. Often, it was something colder. A glance, a pause in conversation, a small shift in posture at the refectory table, and above all, silence. This silence served many purposes. It was spiritual discipline, yes, but also social glue. A tool to smooth over what could not be acknowledged. If a nun cried during prayer, no one asked why. If she flinched at a touch, no one inquired. If she disappeared from the chapel for days, there was no announcement. Life simply continued, as if the rhythm alone could erase what happened in its gaps. Within this culture of silence, secrecy flourished. Whispers were rare but potent, passed quickly in the laundry room, exchanged in the flicker of candlelight during shared chores, a sister's sudden illness. A novice moved to another abbey without explanation, a visiting priest whose name was never spoken again. These fragments floated, untethered, unresolved, and eventually sank beneath the daily tide of chant and confession. No one pursued them. To ask too many questions was itself a form of disobedience. Even formal communications were heavily controlled. Letters to family were read by superiors before they could be sent. Visits from outsiders were observed or denied altogether. The inner life of the abbey was a closed circuit. What happened inside stayed inside. This was for spiritual purity, the Church said, for the protection of sacred vows. But it also served another function, containment. Scandal, after all, was contagious, and the Church had long feared what one woman's failure might inspire in another. That fear was not unfounded. There were stories, hidden in archives whispered by scholars, of nuns who ran away in the night to meet lovers in secret, of pregnancies concealed beneath layers of woolen robes, of sisters who confessed not to demons or divine visions, but to desires the Church had no words for. When such truths surfaced, they were not addressed directly. They were absorbed, swallowed by the convent systems of discipline, redirection, and, most powerfully, omission. Because secrecy was not always about punishment, more often it was about preservation. The abbess had a responsibility not only to her sisters, but to the reputation of the house. A convent known for disorder risked losing donations, losing its bishop's favour, even being dissolved. So shame was hidden for the sake of the group. A single nun's crisis could not be allowed to jeopardize the whole, and so the community learned to look away. When Sister Helene began speaking to shadows in the chapel, the sisters prayed more. When she screamed during matins, they sang louder. When she was moved to the infirmary, no one visited her room. And when, months later, a young novice was asked to take her place in the choir stalls, the adjustment was quiet, seamless. The pages of the Psalter turned as though nothing had happened. This was not cruelty, it was survival. The nuns, like all people, were products of their world. A world that prized obedience over truth, ritual over emotion. And within that world, secrecy became a mercy. To acknowledge scandal was to make it real. To name it was to be tainted by it. Better, then, to let it dissolve, unsaid, undocumented, unremembered. Yet not everything vanished. Some nuns kept private journals carefully hidden. Others confided in confessors whose records still rest in forgotten archives. A few wrote coded notes in the margins of liturgical texts, stray initials, tiny drawings, a line of poetry in a trembling hand. These scraps are the whispers that remain, echoes of voices not meant to be heard, testimonies not of rebellion, but of presence. We don't know what happened to most of them. Sister Clara, who vanished from records in 1342. Sister Beatrice, who was transferred 3 times in a single year. Sister Marie, whose name is crossed out in the convent's annual ledger, replaced only by a symbol we can only guess. And maybe that's part of the power, because in a world where silence was armor, every surviving whisper is a rebellion, a thread unraveled from the veil, a breath that refused to stay hidden. And as we listen, gently, respectfully, we begin to hear them again. Not shouting, not crying, just speaking. Softly, from behind the veil. It usually began with a letter. Not one the sister herself wrote, but one written about her. Folded neatly by the abbess, sealed with wax, and handed to a trusted messenger. It would travel quietly, without announcement, perhaps across a forest, or down a worn cobblestone road to another abbey some distance away. And when it arrived, it would be read behind closed doors. A polite request, a transfer. Temporary, of course, for the good of the sister, for the good of the house. To outsiders, a transfer might seem administrative, a logistical matter. After all, convents and monasteries exchanged members with some regularity, especially novices still in formation. A new setting, new tasks, new guidance. But within the cloister, these movements carried more weight. They were rarely arbitrary, and they often signaled something had gone wrong. There was a language to these transfers, subtle, euphemistic. A sister was in need of new spiritual surroundings. She would benefit from stricter discipline, or her devotion would deepen under a different rule. No one said what truly prompted the move. They didn't have to. The silence was enough. Perhaps she had spoken too freely, asked questions the abbess could not answer. Perhaps she had been found walking in the garden too late, meeting someone through the grate, or receiving letters from a layman whose name was now forbidden to mention. Or perhaps nothing had happened at all, only whispers. A change in demeanour, a lingering gaze, a silence too still to ignore. Whatever the reason, the process was calm, controlled. The abbess would call the sister in private, speak softly of God's will, of new beginnings. The sister might nod, she might resist, but she would go. In the early hours of morning, before the others had risen, a mule cart waiting outside, her meagre possessions folded into a basket, her habit neat, her veil freshly pressed, and when the bells rang for prime, her absence would be noted, but not explained. She had been reassigned, that was all. In some cases she arrived at her new home with a warm welcome. The receiving abbess, briefed in advance, would speak kindly, assign her a cell, a new confessor, new tasks. It was an opportunity, they said, a renewal, a way to put past confusion behind her. In these cases life might resume, quietly, uneventfully, but not always. Sometimes the sister arrived already stained with suspicion. Whispers had preceded her. Other sisters watched with caution. The tasks she was given were menial, scrubbing, carrying water, mending broken sandals. No choir, no copying of texts, no leadership roles. She was to be watched, not punished exactly, but observed. She might not even know why, only that she had been moved, that her old home no longer wanted her. This was the gentlest form of removal. There were harsher kinds. If a scandal involved pregnancy, a not entirely rare occurrence in convents, especially those with visiting priests or lax enclosure, the response was swift and absolute. The sister was removed before her condition became visible, her name struck from the records, her future uncertain. Where did she go? Some were placed in smaller, rural priories, others sent to houses of penance, where daily life was harsher, privacy nearly non-existent, and silence even more strictly enforced. In rare cases, the church might arrange for the child to be raised elsewhere, and the mother returned after confession and a suitable period of reparation. But many simply disappeared from the ledgers. There were also nuns accused not of sin, but of disturbance, spiritual ecstasy that verged on hysteria, repeated visions no one else could verify, disobedience cloaked in mysticism. These sisters were problematic, not because they were wicked, but because they drew attention. Their behavior unsettled the calm order of the cloister. They threatened the abbey's reputation. A single sister crying out in chapel could attract unwanted interest from the bishop, and so she too might be transferred. Or if the house had influence, she might be reinterred. A soft word for being hidden in an internal cell, denied certain freedoms, allowed only minimal contact with others. A convent within the convent. A cloister within the cloister. All without punishment, without confrontation, just redirection. This system of quiet removal served several purposes. It preserved the illusion of perfect order. It protected the abbey from scandal. And perhaps most importantly, it allowed the community to continue functioning without disruption. The removed sister became a memory, quickly replaced by a new novice, a new chant, a new prayer to recite. But what did it feel like for the sister herself? To be asked, ordered, to leave the only home she had known since girlhood. To arrive in a new place, watched and unwelcome, with a reputation she could not correct. To wonder what had been said in letters she never saw. To feel herself slowly erased, not by punishment but by absence. Some adapted, some found peace in new surroundings, but others unravelled. In a convent in southern France, A sister named Isabel was transferred after she was caught writing poetry deemed too passionate. Her verses praised the Virgin with such intensity that her superior feared they bordered on heresy or something else. She was sent to a stricter house. There she never spoke again. In another case, a nun named Colette was moved after a mysterious illness took hold of her. She claimed to be visited by angels. Her sisters believed she was possessed. After her transfer, she vanished from the record. No death date, no reassignment, nothing. Not all these stories ended in tragedy. Some transfers allowed for renewal, a different abbess, a gentler rule, a second chance. But the system itself, opaque, unaccountable, final, was always there, a quiet mechanism, a way of removing what did not fit without ever admitting it had existed. And so the convent remained calm, the chants continued, the ledgers stayed clean, and the sisters learned wordlessly what could never be said aloud, that not all departures were departures, some were silences, carried away in the early morning mist, and left unspoken. Not all transgressions were met with transfer. Some were dealt with internally, within the stone walls, beneath the silent arches, in the dim corners of cloistered life, where discipline unfolded not as drama, but as ritual. The mechanisms of correction were refined, quiet, and often unseen. And for those who lived through them, the boundary between penitence and punishment became difficult to discern. To be a nun in the medieval period was to live under a layered discipline. There were the rules of the cloister, daily prayers, silence, obedience. Then the rule of the order, whether Benedictine, Cistercian, or Poor Clare. And beyond that, the expectations of the church, the local bishop, the abbess, and often, most pressingly, the community of women around you. Within that complex framework, deviation, even slight, could trigger a response. But rarely did it begin with confrontation. More often, the process began with subtle withdrawal. A sister might find herself uninvited from certain duties. Her access to books might be restricted. She might be reassigned from scriptorium to kitchen, from choir to laundry. These small changes communicated disapproval in a language more powerful than scolding, because they were quiet. And in a world where daily life was structured around communal labor and shared ritual, exclusion could feel like exile. The next step was usually confession, not voluntary required. The sister would be brought to a spiritual advisor, often the house confessor, or an appointed cleric. There she would be asked to speak frankly of her sins, not just those of action, but of thought, pride, jealousy, doubt. Perhaps she had questioned the abbess. Perhaps she had written verses too full of yearning. Perhaps she had spoken with too much fondness of the outside world. These things might seem small, but within cloister walls they carried the weight of defiance. Once the sin was named, penance would be assigned. It varied widely. Some sisters were given simple corrections, additional prayers, longer fasting, kneeling in silence during meals. Others were placed under correctional silence, a period of complete muteness, often lasting days or weeks during which they could not speak, even during permitted hours. They might be required to sleep without blankets, to eat alone, standing facing the wall, to carry out tasks at hours when others were resting. These punishments were meant to purify, to strip away pride, to restore humility. But in practice they also served another function. They isolated, made visible the distance between the offending sister and her community. The line between sacred discipline and personal humiliation was not always clear. Sometimes the corrections were more severe. Flagellation, self-administered or ordered, was not uncommon in certain orders. A sister might be instructed to beat herself with a knotted cord each night before compline. Or the abbess might conduct the ritual personally, reciting psalms as the blows were delivered. It was meant to be spiritual, an imitation of Christ's suffering, a path to humility, but for many it was simply pain. There were also confinement cells, small, dark, removed from the dormitory. A sister might be locked inside for days, allowed only bread and water. No books, no voice. Her prayers silent, her thoughts circling. She was told to reflect, to atone, to remember her vows. Some broke under the weight of it. Others emerged calm, more subdued, more compliant. The abbess would consider that a success. Yet still, behind the official justifications, one sees the outlines of fear. These punishments were not simply about correction. They were about containment, about preventing the spread of disobedience, about sending a message to the other sisters. This is what happens when you step beyond the line. But the line itself was never fixed. In some houses a poem might be praised, in others condemned. In one abbey visions brought honour, in another suspicion. What counted as disobedience shifted with personalities, politics and perception. And so the sisters watched each other and themselves with careful attention. Over time, many internalized the rules so deeply they no longer questioned them. A sigh during prayer became a sin. A forgotten phrase, a failing. To be pious was not enough. One had to appear pious, always. This vigilance fed into the disciplinary system. Most punishments were not the result of public scandal, but of small breaches. Moments of weakness, a laugh during silence, a lost temper, a daydream confessed. And once named, the sister herself often agreed with the punishment. She had failed. She must do better. There is a sadness in that, a kind of quiet resignation, but also perhaps a comfort, because within the rigidity there was a sense of order, a framework, a path to redemption, even if that path sometimes wound through solitude, hunger, and shame. The Church believed it was saving these women from sin, from pride, from the temptations of the flesh, but it also silenced them, shaped them into vessels of obedience. And when the system failed, when punishment turned to cruelty, there were few who could intervene. Some sisters never recovered. One account from a 14th century German convent describes a novice named Margareta who confessed to thoughts of rebellion. She had imagined escaping the walls, seeing her family again. For this, she was placed under strict correction. 1 week of silence, 3 days of isolation, repeated flagellation. When she returned to the community, she spoke in whispers, flinched at touch, and refused to write. Her thoughts, once dangerous, had been erased. The abbey records list her as corrected and restored, but we do not hear her voice again. And so the question lingers. Was it penitence or punishment? A spiritual healing or a slow unseen wound? In the stillness of the convent, where chants echoed through long stone halls and the flicker of candles cast wavering shadows on the walls, the answer was never spoken aloud, only felt and eventually forgotten by everyone but the woman who bore it. History is not only shaped by those who live it, but by those who write it down. And in the medieval monastery, the role of the scribe was sacred. He, or occasionally she, in certain convents, was the hand of memory, the vessel of preservation. Cloistered away in a scriptorium, hunched over a heavy desk lit only by candle or daylight through slitted windows, the scribe copied psalms, chronicled saints' lives, recorded births and deaths. His ink gave permanence to prayers. Her script granted authority to silence, but scribes did not merely transcribe, they curated. They decided what deserved to be remembered, and what was better left unrecorded. The Church, with its emphasis on moral clarity and spiritual order, had every incentive to present itself as flawless, especially in times when its moral authority was questioned, its leaders embroiled in power struggles, or when whispers of scandal risked rippling outward beyond the cloister walls. So scribes became, in effect, the editors of ecclesiastical history. With quill in hand and judgment shaped by doctrine, they clipped, trimmed, and sometimes erased entirely. Imagine a convent ledger, bound in leather, its pages thick with time, a list of sisters, names, dates of entry, duties assigned, and then, midway through the list, a blot. A name that had once been written, now scratched out with care. The ink smudged. The parchment slightly torn, no explanation. Just absence. A small violence committed against memory. These moments are not uncommon in surviving documents. Gaps where names should be. Notes added in a different hand. Marginalia that raises more questions than it answers. Transferred under order, one scribe might write. Removed by episcopal authority, says another. Occasionally, a small cross is drawn beside the name of a nun, symbolizing death or disgrace or both. The ambiguity was deliberate. To the reader, centuries later, the truth remains hidden beneath layers of politeness and euphemism. Sometimes, entire sections of documents were cut away, literally removed, the parchment carefully sliced, the pages resewn. This kind of redaction was rare but telling. It suggests not mere embarrassment but fear of discovery, of scandal, of rupture, because even the illusion of sin could threaten an abbey's reputation, and reputation meant everything. We often imagine history as a tapestry rich with interwoven threads, each detail supporting the whole. But in monastic records it is just as often a palimpsest, a text scraped clean and written over. You might see the faint impression of earlier words beneath the surface. A name faded but not fully gone. A sentence begun and abruptly stopped. Sometimes the ghost of a confession remains, though the words themselves are gone. The scribes, of course, had reasons. They were not censors in the modern sense. They were guardians of sanctity, protectors of the church's image. They believed, often sincerely, that preserving peace and piety in writing was as important as preserving truth. To record a scandal was to invite its memory. To omit it was to allow healing. That was the logic. And so, when a nun's pregnancy threatened to shame the house, her name might be omitted from the year's records. If a sister had a vision deemed heretical, her diary might be seized and burned, though perhaps one page would survive, tucked into a psalter too beautiful to destroy. Even the biographies of saints were crafted with caution. Their failings minimized, their doubts softened, their moments of rage or longing recast as trials of faith. Catherine of Siena, whose ecstatic visions challenged church hierarchy, had her more radical statements edited out posthumously. Hildegard of Bingen's complex theology was streamlined into orthodoxy. The messiness of lived experience shaped to fit the contours of doctrine. This kind of editorial work was not malicious, it was strategic. The church understood the power of narrative, and monasteries understood their place within it. The result was a carefully constructed history, one that elevated virtue, glossed over failure, and ensured that the sins of the few would not taint the perception of the many. But in doing so, it also erased countless voices. Lives that deviated from the ideal were folded back into silence, their complexity lost. A nun who struggled with desire, a novice who wrote too boldly, a sister who confessed to dreams she didn't understand. Their stories, if written down at all, were likely edited or destroyed, and even when records survived, they were often reframed to protect the institution. A report might say, Sister Benedetta suffered from spiritual illness. It might mean she cried at night, or that she broke her vows. It might mean she was exorcised, or sent away. We cannot know. What we do know is that silence was built not only in stone and ritual, but in ink. Even now, when scholars study these texts, they must read not only what is there, but what is missing. They look at the margins, they study watermarks, they analyze handwriting. They seek the moments where the truth peeks through, a smudged word, an ink blot that should not be there. And sometimes they find something. A poem tucked into the back of a choir book. A letter copied twice, once in Latin, once in the vernacular, with small changes between. a confession never sent. These fragments allow us to glimpse the women behind the walls, not just as obedient daughters of God, but as full people, complex, troubled, alive. And so the scribe's scissors, while sharp, did not cut everything. Memory has a way of surviving, even in erasure, even in silence, even in the quiet spaces between lines. In the quiet rhythms of cloistered life, few moments were as personal or as heavily monitored as confession. It was, at least in theory, the one space where a nun could speak freely, where she could unburden herself to God through the ear of his chosen servant. The confessional promised forgiveness, a return to spiritual grace, a chance to begin again. But in the medieval convent, confession was not only a sacrament, it was a tool, and sometimes it became a subtle form of control. The priest was not a member of the community. He came from outside, sent by the bishop or chosen by the abbess with diocesan approval. He did not live within the convent walls, but his presence was deeply felt. He heard the secrets no one else heard. He held knowledge that could shape a woman's fate. And depending on his nature, gentle, ambitious, suspicious, political, that knowledge could be used in different ways. For many nuns, confession was a comfort, a space to speak fears they dared not voice elsewhere, to whisper their guilt, their doubts, their weariness, to admit they missed their families or feared their own thoughts. These confessions were often sincere, and the priest responded with reassurance, prayer, and appropriate penance, usually mild, sometimes strict. But in some houses, confession became something more, because a nun's words could reveal more than sin. They could expose disobedience, emotional unrest, forbidden contact, and once confessed, those words were no longer entirely her own. The priest, trusted with her spiritual well-being, might also feel a duty to protect the convent's discipline. He might inform the abbess. He might advise surveillance. Or worse, he might withhold absolution unless she agreed to certain conditions. Greater silence, removal from choir, a vow of obedience beyond what was required. In those moments, confession became leverage, a way to guide, to steer, or to silence. The confessional was not always a booth. In most convents, it took place through a screened window in a small room. The nun knelt on one side, the priest sat on the other, their faces hidden from view. This physical barrier was meant to guard chastity, to prevent improper familiarity. But it also gave the priest anonymity, a kind of unassailable authority. His voice emerged from behind the screen like the voice of God. And sometimes that voice asked difficult questions. Did you speak to Sister Clare after hours? Have you had dreams of a worldly nature? Did you entertain affection for the visiting friar? These were not always gentle inquiries. They could be sharp, interrogative. And for a woman already burdened by guilt, the pressure could become overwhelming. Some confessed to things they had only imagined. Others, desperate for forgiveness, offered more than they should. And in doing so, they handed over pieces of themselves, fragile, private pieces, into the hands of a man who could use them as he saw fit. To be clear, many priests acted with compassion. They offered true spiritual guidance. They protected the sisters' privacy and steered them back toward peace. But others, particularly in politically sensitive abbeys, used confession as a form of internal policing. Reports survive of confessors compiling notes, not always with malicious intent, but for the bishop, or to justify decisions made by superiors. One nun in Burgundy was disciplined after her confessor revealed that she had expressed doubts about the abbess' leadership. Another in Italy was sent to a penance house after admitting in confidence that she no longer believed in her visions. There were cases, too, where the line between confession and manipulation blurred more darkly. A powerful priest might flatter a young novice, encourage her to speak freely, invite her to confess more often than required. And in that intimacy, the boundary between spiritual and emotional entanglement became dangerously thin. Sometimes scandal followed, sometimes silence. Either way, the priest's role remained largely unquestioned. He was the confessor, the guardian of souls. And though technically external to the convent, his influence often extended further than any abbess. The Church, recognizing this imbalance, eventually imposed rules, limits on frequency, on language used, even on the physical structure of the confessional itself. But enforcement was inconsistent, and in many places custom trumped policy. For the nuns, confession remained both a necessity and a risk. It was the only place to speak their inner world. But what they said there could shape the outer one. Some learned to say only what was expected, to confess routine failings, pride, distraction, occasional impatience. These were safe, forgivable. Others said more and suffered for it. But still they went, because in that moment of kneeling, of quiet speech through the screen, there was at least the feeling of being heard, of being seen, even if the result was not healing, but correction. Even if their words became someone else's tools, even if the confessional, dark, still, echoing with whispered prayers, was not a sanctuary but a mirror. One where their faults were not only reflected but recorded, stored, used, and forgotten. Until the next sister knelt, hands folded, eyes closed, voice trembling, and the cycle began again. In the stillness of a monastic archive, where the air is thick with the scent of ancient parchment and the silence feels as heavy as stone, there are records, hundreds of them, thousands, carefully catalogued ledgers bound in leather, written in hand so neat they could have been carved. They tell us of births, deaths, donations, of abbacies elected and novices received, of relics moved and fasts observed. But every so often, scattered between these dry details, we find something else, something unexpected. A name crossed out without reason. A poem in a trembling feminine hand slipped into a missal. A note in the margin. She wept again, alone at vespers. These fragments are faint, disconnected. They don't tell us full stories, but they whisper. And in their whispers, we begin to sense the outlines of scandals we were never meant to know. Not the grand public scandals of kings and cardinals, but small ones, personal ones. A nun who fell in love. A novice who ran away. A priest who heard too much in the confessional and chose silence over duty. These were not written in bold ink. They were hinted at, obscured, erased. Yet they survived, somehow. Through accident, through defiance, through the simple failure of secrecy to be absolute. In a monastery near modern-day Ghent, a 15th century account book includes a single entry. Payment for transport of Sister A.M. to the House of Reparation. No reason is given, no other mention of her appears in the convent's records. But in a different archive, several miles away, a surviving letter from a visiting bishop mentions a disgraceful incident involving a novice and a visiting Dominican. No names are given, but the dates match. And suddenly the silence has edges. Or consider the chronicle of a convent in northern Italy, where the scribe records, somewhat coldly, the removal of 2 sisters whose behavior threatened the discipline of the house. No details, no explanation. But in the margins, another hand, fainter, more fluid, has written just one word beside their names: unjust. It is in these small acts of preservation that history re-emerges, because for every scandal hidden, someone always remembered. A sister who refused to forget. A confessor who recorded a version of events in his private notes. A scribe who, perhaps moved by conscience, tucked a forbidden letter into a book no one read. These acts were quiet rebellions. Against erasure, against simplicity, against the kind of perfect history the Church preferred. They remind us that behind the institution was humanity, flawed feelings, sometimes defiant. Not every scandal ended in punishment. Some ended in change. In time, certain abbeys became more lenient. Some orders embraced mysticism more fully, allowing space for the ecstatic, the strange, the unpredictable. And as printing advanced, the Church lost some control over narrative. Stories spread, memoirs were written. By the 17th century, a few former nuns published accounts of their lives, coded, discreet, but unmistakable. Even earlier, some bishops kept private letters. These now rest in diocesan archives, where modern scholars sometimes stumble upon them. They tell of pregnancies concealed and forgiven, of spiritual breakdowns handled with surprising compassion, of abbesses who bent rules to protect their sisters. These aren't always the stories of repression. Sometimes they're stories of quiet mercy, but they were meant to remain hidden. And the fact that they did not, that we can now read them centuries later, is a kind of miracle. A gentle reminder that truth has a way of enduring, even when institutions try to erase it. Today, historians pore over these records not for scandal, but for connection. They seek to understand, not to judge, to listen with care to voices barely audible beneath the pages, to reconstruct lives not for spectacle, but for empathy. What we find is not always salacious. More often it is deeply human. Loneliness, yearning, courage. A nun who hid poetry in her psalter. A novice who questioned her vows but stayed. An abbess who covered for her sister's mistake, risking her own reputation. These are the scandals that survived, not because someone shouted, but because someone whispered, and someone else listened. And now so do we. In the gentle hush of night, as sleep approaches, we remember them. Not as warnings, not as sinners, not even as victims, but as women. Women whose stories refused to vanish, whose silence was never complete, whose lives, once wrapped in secrecy, now speak softly across centuries. And in that whisper, history breathes.